1,462 for Remain, 62% for Leave, 38% for Remain. Laura.
I just, as David Davis and Alex Salmond are sitting there, I just can't help but put a conundrum to the two of them. But I'm sure they wouldn't agree on the answer. But if it does become the case that Scottish
They never agree
votes,
on anything much.
But if Scottish votes keep the UK in the European Union, where English votes have pointed out, what are the implications? I mean, David Davis, how would you and your backbench colleagues feel about that as a constitutional
Not at all. We're a
settlement?
United Kingdom. I mean, virtually every pro-Leave MP is a strong unionist. So we accept the judgment of the whole kingdom.
Do you think all of your colleagues who fought so hard in this campaign would accept the result if Scottish votes keep the UK inside the European Union?
They have to. I mean, the simple truth is you have a referendum. You can hardly say this is a low turnout referendum. You can hardly say this is not a representative view of the people. If it had been 30%, it might be a different argument. You can't say that. And if you believe in the kingdom, you must believe in the result for the whole kingdom.
And Alex, just a Labour source is already blaming the SNP for a lacklustre campaign in the referendum. What do you say to that?
Well,
you say the percentages all look very healthy for Remain, but turnout does appear in Scotland to be lower than the rest of the UK.
Well, our campaign in Scotland has yielded a very positive result. In industrial areas where we represent, Remain is winning 60-40. In the industrial areas that Labour represent in England, they're getting absolutely hammered. So I think the Labour Party are casting about for responsibility. They should look to themselves. If they'd fought the campaign that we'd fought in Scotland, perhaps they'd be in a happier position this evening.
Just before we go to look at Wales in a moment, do you think referendum's a good way of conducting political business?
For big constitutional issues only. Because we don't own the Constitution. We don't own the future of the country. And so if you decide whether or not Scotland's independent, that's a decision for the whole people. If you want to decide whether we're in or outside the kingdom, that's a decision for the whole people.
Do you agree with that? Was it a wise decision to have a referendum?
Well, it's the only way to decide big constitutional issues. But with this proviso, if you're proposing a referendum, you should want to change something, establish an independent country. David Cameron fought a referendum basically not wanting to change anything. That was a fundamental mistake.
And then maybe to find he has to change things.
Well, it's very difficult to fight an inspiring campaign saying, follow me, I don't really want to change very much.
Right, thank you very much. Wales, let's just have a look at the latest results we've had in from Wales. Blue for Leave, Swansea, Flintshire, Blaenau Gwent and Merthyr Tydfil. And we're joined from Wales by James Williams. How is Wales turning out, James, in your view?
From everything that I've heard from political sources, from all parties and from both campaigns, it seems at this very early stage, and there must be a health warning added to this, that it seems that Wales is leaning towards Brexit. From everything I've heard, the valley seats that we were talking about at the start of the night, Merthyr, as we know, is already gone. We're talking about Blaenau Gwent is already gone. We're talking about Caerphilly is going, we hear that Rhondda might be going as well. There are some bright spots for the Remain campaign. I'm hearing that they're looking at about a 60-40 split in Cardiff, which is obviously the capital city and the high population density there. But Swansea, we're hearing, is also going for Brexit. Denbighshire, Conwy, Anglesey as well is nip and tuck. So at the moment, all the indications is that Wales is heading for Brexit. But as I said, it's early days as we speak.
Yes, I mean, you talk about Cardiff, where there are large numbers of voters. If you look at it in terms of the numbers as opposed to the places that have gone Leave or Remain, are you saying that the actual numbers of votes cast will favour Leave in Wales?
Well, that is something we'll have to keep an eye on, obviously. But I'm saying in terms of the number of councils that we understand are going one way or the other, a significant number of them seem to be going towards Brexit. How that totals up at the end, well, it's still to be seen, but it seems that the tide is only going one way at the moment, at least.
Kind of have to be a bit careful about voting areas and counting areas as opposed to the actual numbers which we're looking at all the time, of course.
One person, one senior Labour figure has just contacted me to say they think it's going to be a Leave win. One figure, very, very early in the night. We keep saying it, but a senior figure in the Labour Party has just contacted me to say that they believe that Leave is actually going to win. And we've been talking about London a lot. Also important to make a distinction there. Inner London sounds like it looks very good for Remain. 1.9 million votes there, many more votes in outer London, which Leave sources still believe looks quite good for them.
A result from Bury voting to Leave, north of, in Greater Manchester, to the north of Greater Manchester. And the Leave vote in Bury is 54,674. These are the numbers that count, 46,354. And the percentage there, 54-46. Peter Henley joins us now from Southampton. And we've not heard anything, of course, from the south, Peter. But do you have news from people's reactions as what might be going to happen?
If Remain thought the South was coming to their rescue, I don't think that's going to happen. Everybody's talking about the Leave vote being ahead of what people expected. In Portsmouth, where it was thought to be about 50-50, they're talking about more like 57% Leave. In Southampton, a big city with lots of estates, they're all supposedly going for Leave, 60-40 for Leave. The count's carrying on behind me for Southampton. We expect the result in an hour or so, but it certainly looks that way. Even Salisbury, they're suggesting Leave has done well there. And it's fraying people's nerves. In Oxford, there was an incident, one of the Labour councillors arrested and taken away by police. He's been taken home. There are a lot of votes in the southeast of England, 6.5 million voters, 67 counting centres, potentially. That's the biggest one. So potentially a lot of votes for whichever side, but it does seem to be going towards Leave at the moment.
Peter, thank you very much. And Alex Salmond here tells me that the voting has now gone in favour of a Leave victory.
In the spread betting, for the first time, Leave are now favourite. Not overwhelming, but now favourite.
There'll be many people watching this who are very unhappy we're talking about betting. Good Presbyterians who don't like particularly in your country.
No, Presbyterians are enthusiastic gamblers in the new Scotland. Absolutely.
Emily.
You Presbyterian.
Let's talk to Sir Vince Cable, senior Lib Dem, joins us now. Your response at this early stage of the night, Vince Cable, particularly what's happening in Wales?
Well, I can't improve on your studio analysis, but it does look increasingly as if Leave are ahead, and that we could perhaps begin to think about the political and economic implications of that. I mean, obviously there's a lot of polarisation. Scotland's in a very different position, nationalist areas in Northern Ireland, and one assumes London. But the Labour voting areas, their support has crumbled very badly and failed to reach expectations. So obviously, I suspect the spread bettors know what they're doing.
You think it's more to do with the Labour vote not coming out rather than the Tory campaign scaring people off?
Well, I had my reservations about some of the techniques that were being used in the Remain side on economics. I mean, I clearly very much in favour of Remain, but I think the techniques didn't work. I mean, the politics of fear were used in the general election against people like me. They were used in Scotland before that, and I think there was an assumption it would work here, and it may not have been. And there are other factors that have kicked in. People in highly deprived areas of the northeast expressing their frustration in this way.
How do you think the Remain camp will have to deal with this if it does emerge as a vote to Leave?
Well, there are some concrete issues which have emerged, and immigration is the most obvious one. And I think the question which David Cameron wasn't able to deal with in his renegotiation, which is some kind of break to provide some kind of reassurance that things are not controlled, I think that issue might well have to be reopened because if Remain does squeak in, and the figures may change with London, there will be a lot of deep heart searching is going to take place. I mean, I suspect that if Remain does win with a majority of 1 or 2%, it could conceivably happen. I mean, the authority of the government is going to nonetheless be considerably weaker than it was before the referendum. I think we're in a period of relatively unstable, weak government.
I want to ask you to reflect for a moment on the nature of the referendum. I guess in an ideal Cameron world, this was never meant to happen. The Lib Dems were expected to be in government with him, and you would have presumably stopped this referendum ever going ahead. Was it a mistake to call it?
Well, we certainly argued it was, and I think for the reasons which Alex Salmon made a few moments ago, I think his analysis was actually spot on. I mean, clearly there are circumstances in which you do need a referendum when you have major constitutional change. We've always accepted that. But this wasn't such an issue. It was a way of resolving an impasse within the Conservative Party. I think there was just a chronic failure to understand what happens when you just throw the cards in the air in that kind of way, all kind of unpredictable things happening, all people's grievances find an outlet, whether it's got anything to do with Europe or not. And it was just a very bad call, a very bad judgment, and I think it will do David Cameron enormous harm.
Enormous harm in the sense that he will have to leave straight away if it is leave?
Well, I mean, you know, my former cabinet colleagues like Ken Clarke have said, well, you know, he's not going to survive 10 seconds if we lose this. I mean, he may. Let's assume that the scenario that it is a leave win. I mean, we don't know that, but let's take that scenario. I mean, if his party do persuade him to stay on, I mean, his authority is completely gone, and I'd have thought that any sense of self-respect would make him want to go. So if we are talking about a leave win, even if it's a very small one, I fear that his day is now gone.
What do you think the response, the real response, shall we say, from European leaders would be towards Britain if it is a leave? I mean, the days of campaigning, the threats are over. Do you think they would come back, try and woo us back in, trading deals and all the rest of it, or do you think the door is slamming shut?
Well, I think that Europe is governed by kind of legal processes to a very significant extent, and they will play out. Obviously, politics forms part of that. I don't think there's any sense of vindictiveness or a kind of anti-British feeling. I don't think that will play in. But nonetheless, they will be desperately anxious to avoid some kind of contagion. So I think any sense that the UK would be rewarded by being given, you know, full access to the single market without paying the costs in terms of accepting free movement or financial contribution, a Norwegian-type outcome, I don't think that's likely to be on offer.
Do you think it could trigger... Sorry to interrupt. Do you think it could trigger more referendums around Europe?
Well, some populist politicians in Europe are making that case. I mean, most of the people I've talked to in some of the peripheral countries, I mean, you know, Sweden's an example, they take the view that even if they did have a referendum, they would stay. I don't think you're going to have rapid fragmentation, but nonetheless, it would be a severe blow to the cohesion of the European Union. I think their instincts would be to stand firm, to make sure that, you know, Britain isn't rewarded from this, and I think that's what what I've worried about all along, that we're now potentially, again, assuming that leave win, entered a very prolonged period of unsettled, unresolved disputes. The whole problem of translating European law back into some kind of British alternative is a very, very difficult process. And I'll be listening carefully to Alex Salmon's comments about Scotland, because the issues with Scotland are not simply would they go for independence. The problem is that with all the devolved powers, many of which have a European dimension, if they don't want to cooperate, what happens? And I think we're potentially entering into an enormous legal quagmire, you know, lasting for years, and that's one of the warnings that I think some of us have been trying to give, and that wasn't really heeded, I think, by the government.
OK, Vince Cable, thank you very much, David.
And we're joined by Aaron Banks, who helped fund Nigel Farage's campaign for UKIP. Thank you for joining us. Mr. Farage was going to and then vanished. What do you make of the result? Do you think you've won?
I think we have. We ran our own poll, which we released after 10 o'clock. It was 52-48. I think that's pretty spot.
Can we hear? We can't hear you very well. Can you hear me all right, Mr.
Sorry?
Banks? Can you hear me okay?
I'm hearing you perfectly, yeah.
Oh,
I
well,
hear you perfectly.
OK, well, you...
Can't hear you.
No, I will be able to. Just, I don't know what's... where's your microphone? Anyway, OK. Just, so you think it's in the bag, do you?
I don't know if it's in the bag, but I think we've got a strong result, and I think I always thought whether we win or lose, we've made the point, really. And I think this will change the European Union. And I think it's actually good news for Europe.
What did you make of what...
I think they're going to have to seriously think about it.
What did you make of what Vince Cable said, that if it really is Brexit, it promises years and years of chaos as they try to unscramble the legal side and enter into trade negotiations and all the rest of it, that it's not at all going to be a simple, straightforward deal?
Well, as I understand it, you exercise Article 50 and you've got 2 years to renegotiate with your partners. I think they're going to be very willing and want to actually renegotiate and come to a sensible deal. It'll be a lot less complicated than the politicians are saying.
How much did you give to the campaign yourself?
Nearly £6 million.
Nearly £6 million? Why?
Yeah.
Why?
It's something I believe in. I believe in that we should bring our democracy back to Parliament, and I think the people have spoken on this. I think win or lose.
Union Referendum Act 2015, and having
Mr.
been
Banks,
authorised
thank you
to
very
do
much
so
indeed.
by the regional counting officer, I hereby give notice that I have certified the following. The total number of ballot papers counted was 37,975. The number of votes cast in favour of remain a member of the European Union was 12,569. The number of votes cast in favour of leave the European Union was 25,385, and there were 21 rejected ballot papers.
North Warwickshire, 66.9% leave, 33% remain. There are the figures again. Leave are now 1,464,000, remain on 1,300,000. The winning post still remains 16,800,000 odd. I'm joined now by John McDonnell, Shadow Chancellor for Labour, MP for Hayes and Harlington, and Theresa Villas, Northern Ireland Secretary, who's been fighting for leave. You said, I think, early on that your instinct was it was going to go to Remain this evening.
Yes.
Do you think that was the instinct? Your instinct had deserted you?
Well, I'd be delighted to be proved wrong. I think obviously we're not able to predict the result, but my feeling was to be confident of a Leave win, I would have expected us to be going into polling day with a strong lead in the polls, because there's always a sort of reversion to the status quo. We tried very hard to demonstrate clearly to people that there is no status quo on the ballot paper. The risks of staying are very significant, but even so, you would expect the status quo option to gain support in the last few days.
And this may not have been triggered by this referendum, this traditional reversion to the status quo.
Well, by the looks of some of the results, it may not have happened, but as we obviously won't know that for another few hours.
Now, you're Northern Ireland Secretary, and you said during the thing there was no risk around illegal migration, trade in goods and the rest. If the UK leaves the EU, and Northern Ireland, of course, being part of the United Kingdom, how can you possibly not have a border between the two to stop goods going across and people coming in across that border?
But we've had a common travel area between the UK and Ireland since the creation of the Irish state nearly 100 years ago. It served both countries well.
Yeah, but we joined the EU together. I'm talking about trade. We joined the EU together, so there'd never been tariffs between us. But now there would be tariff barriers.
The reality is, if you look around the EU's external borders, thousands of lorries and goods pass every day without any restrictions. Modern technology means it is possible to deal with these issues, and it would be manifestly in the interest of both the UK and Ireland that we find a way to do that. And after all, the Irish ambassador to London himself has been very clear the common travel area is not affected by a Brexit vote.
There's the Northern Ireland, just have a look, there's the Northern Ireland figure, of course, Remain, and this is the other thing about Northern Ireland, it's likely to be a Remain part of Britain. 165, 278, 131, 342, leave. The DUP, of course, were in favour of leaving. the nationalists in favour of remaining. John McDonnell is also with us here. I have to cut to the chase with you. There's been a lot of talk about whether Labour was pulling its weight in this campaign, hasn't there? And that in some senses you may have lost a crucial part of this working-class vote who've been disaffected and gone for leave, and that you've failed somehow to tap into that.
Well, I've toured around the country, and the result that's coming out now is, to be frank, is exactly as I thought. I think it's going to be extremely close. And there is a disaffected vote, and it's disaffected with politics overall, disaffected with Westminster politics in particular. Some of that is our Labour supporters too, and we've done our best to try and turn that round, but it's been tough. And it gets to feel like a by-election at the moment, where people's grievances are being aired as well as a result of this vote. People are concerned about how they've been treated with austerity and wages being frozen for the last 7 years. So a lot of people's grievances are coming out, and we've got to start listening to them.
London is thought to be one place where the Remain campaign will do well. We've had our first big result, and we had the City of London earlier. Here is Lambeth in South London. 30,340 for Leave, 111,584 for Remain. That's 21 to 79% Remain. And then we go to Exeter. We've got Exeter in the West Country, in Devon, and that's a Remain vote again, 55% for Remain, 45% for Leave. We'll just check on how Sterling's doing with Kamal. What's happened in the markets?
David, it's still going down pretty rapidly.
Sterling's still falling?
Sterling's still falling. It's down now at around $1.40. Got as high as 150 when there was a lot of confidence in the markets that Remain were going to win. There's another very important indicator, though, called the FTSE Futures, which is a judgment on where the FTSE 100 will open when it opens in London later on this morning, and that is down 5%. Both those indicators, these percentages sound quite small, but both those indicators, those are huge moves in the markets. The type of moves possibly for the pound not seen before, or certainly not since the 2008 financial crisis, and also for the FTSE 100. A 5% fall in a market would be a significant event and would really create a sense, I think, at that stage that the markets were in a major sell-off territory. And I think that the Bank of England now and others must be considering, if there is a Leave vote, and of course, as we said, we keep saying we're a long way from knowing that there may have to be some form of announcements made in the morning. Just to make one point clear, at the moment in sterling, the market is very thin on volumes. There aren't actually many traders trading the pound at the moment. So that means the volatility is very marked, because people moving can make very volatile spikes. So just to put that sort of slight warning and caveat into these numbers, but certainly the volatility is huge in market terms.
And the city is open all night tonight?
Trading. Forex is trading all night. Trades 24 hours a day all around the world. On the Asian markets, the pound is down 5%. So it's down between 5 and 6%. And what's called these intraday moves within 1 day's trading, these are figures not seen, as I say, since the 2008 financial crisis, which I think just does show the level of market concern, I think more to do with uncertainty than to do with whether Britain is in or out of the European Union. As I said, I think at the opening of this programme, it's not political, this issue. It's not a judgment on whether Leave or Remain should or shouldn't win. It's about that uncertainty issue. It's about the notion of how will we trade with the European Union, which, of course, is our biggest market for export.
John McDonnell, you're the Shadow Chancellor. Of course, you're not allowed to talk about sterling, because Chancellors and Shadow Chancellors can't discuss sterling. He can. You can't. But what about the markets generally? And are you concerned about what you're hearing from your left?
I think some of the claims on both sides of the campaign were exaggerated about a recession, but we've always made it clear there would be a shock if the Remain camp didn't win and it was Leave. And that's exactly the sort of shock we're expecting. So I would expect the Bank of England to intervene in the morning. And I think we can't, Chancellors and Shadow Chancellors can't comment on sterling, but what we can do is have a mature approach to this and say, whatever the outcome, we will negotiate the best deal we possibly can with regard to our trading partners in Europe And in that way, we might give some assurances to the market.
Glasgow has come in, the first large city in Scotland to come in, indeed the largest in numbers, 84,000 for Leave and 168,335 for Remain. So that's 67% share for Remain, 33% for Leave, boosting the number in Scotland. And Falkirk also came in, where the count is being conducted, 34,271 for Leave, 44,987 Remain. That's 43% for Leave and 57% for Remain. And this is how Scotland overall is looking, with 17 of its counting areas declared, 38% Leave and 62% Remain. So, Jeremy, do you want on your slidometer to show us how things are going?
Well, I tell you what's happened.
It's not a swingometer, is it?
Well, we have got a kind of swingometer for you later, which we'll bring out when the figures settle down. For now, we're calling it an index. You could, by all means, call it a slidometer. That's fine. It shows the 382 counting areas by size here. That's the length of the bar. But crucially, by the order of which they're arranged in terms of their Euroscepticism. Over this side, here we are, look, just at this end. Let's see it, where it says most Leave. See how many there are. And just come around here, and right at the other end, we have most Remain. Now, two things have happened just in the last few minutes, which we wanted to mention. The first thing is some very good news for Leave, with this one particular result from Swansea. And here's why. If I bring you Swansea out on our polling index, you will see it is this side of the centre. So it's on the Remain side. It's come in for Leave. So it's the first council we've seen, or counting area we've seen, where you've actually got blue in a yellow area. Let's see the percentage now. And this is the kind of thing the winning side needs to do, is to paint the opposing area blue or yellow. 52% for Leave and 48% for Remain. So that's very good for Leave. They're winning in a place where Remain were expected to win. But a different result from Lambeth, and I want to show you this now. If we go to the most Remain end, we've got a lot of London and Scotland, actually, on the Remain end for all the reasons discussed. London and Scotland will be likely the highest votes for Remain. Lambeth is right there. An awful lot of voters in Lambeth. Look at the length of the bar. But also look at the proportion of yellow on that bar. That is the margin of the Remain win. Now, this result from Lambeth is pretty much the first really good piece of good news for Remain tonight, because 79% is beyond what was expected, even with them on that far end of the bar. 79% Remain, 21% Leave. If Remain are going to pull this back, they're going to do it through building up majorities like that in dense urban centres. So Lambeth, suddenly, Remain have a moment with Lambeth where they think, if that happens all over London, there are an awful lot of votes coming their way.
We've just had Wandsworth in, Jeremy, as you speak, so in southwest London, including Tooting, where Sadiq Khan, the new mayor of London, came from. They're the raw figures: 118,000 for Remain, 39,000 for Leave, 25% for Leave, 75% for Remain. I don't know whether, John Curtis, that is good news for Remain, whether they expected to do better in both Lambeth and Wandsworth.
Those are both good results for Remain. In both cases, we're looking at figures for Remain that are about some 10 points above what we're expecting. So it's beginning to look as though London will indeed, even though we were expecting Remain to do well, may well do even better there. Contrarily, however, some of the first results from the northwest, places like St Helens, we are seeing the Remain side being well adrift. So it may be, we were long talking about in this referendum campaign about the potential difference between Scotland and England. We may also be talking about a major difference between London and the rest of England. And that at the end of the day, if indeed the United Kingdom does vote to leave, and we're not saying that's what's going to happen yet by any means, but if it does, it will be provincial England that will have determined the UK's fate.
You were talking earlier about turnout in London. Has turnout in London affected these raw figures? Has had the effect you thought, or were the turnout figures accurate?
Well, I mean, what does seem to be true is that the increase in turnout in London above what we got in last year's general election seems to be somewhat less than it is in most other parts of the UK. It's rising by about 4 points or so in London. It's 6 points across the country as a whole. We should say, by the way, we've not really said this so far. I mean, at the beginning of the night, we were talking about very high turnouts. Well, that's a bit of an exaggeration. But it does look as though we've got something like a 72% turnout for this referendum, which will be the first time since 1997 in a UK-wide vote that we've got more of a 70% turnout. So the truth is, whoever does win this referendum, we still don't know who it's going to be, and those London results have added to the uncertainty. It will be very difficult to argue that they don't have a mandate and the country has not made a clear decision. Voters have been engaged by this referendum in a way that, frankly, recent general elections have rather failed to interest them.
And, of course, the percentage is not a reflection of the actual numbers, because there have been a lot of people who've put their names on the register to vote who weren't there before.
Indeed. So the
as a
fact
result
that
of this campaign.
Indeed. So the fact that we've got 72% of the vote, even though about 1.7 million added their names to the register since last December, is an indication of, as it were, an even greater democratic success than it otherwise would be.
We've had a leave from London, Barking and Dagenham, in East London, and 46,000, 27,000, 62%, 38%.
Yeah, that isn't surprising, David, but actually here now we get out of, as it were, the inner metropolitan core of London to an area where historically the far right's done rather well, and the Remain vote is actually quite well adrift of what we were expecting. So as Laura was suggesting earlier, it may be parts of London, maybe the inner core of London where there are a lot of young, mobile people, lots of them living in the city, etc., etc. Once we get outer towards London, which is rather more like the rest of England, maybe Remain will be struggling rather more.
And just a reminder over the UK as a whole, at the moment, the Leave side is running at 49.3% and Remain 50.7%. I mean, we keep showing these figures of percentages from counting areas. Remember, it doesn't actually amount to a row of beans. What matters is the raw numbers. And Leave is on 2,393,000 at the moment, and Remain on 2,462,000. That's what we have to look at. Here we are at Broadcasting House, BH, as it's lovingly called, saying it's too early to call, but have a look at the figures projecting there on the front. The yellow for Remain at 50.7 and Leave at 49.3. And I think it still has to do something for us. Oh, it doesn't. I thought it emerged in some strange way. Anyway, there we are. There is Broadcasting House on the left and the new Broadcasting House on the right, all bright blue where the piazza is, added recently to the old building. Well, it's just after 2:30. We ought to get some news now. So let's have the news right now. Here's Rita Chakrabarti again. Rita.
Thank you, David. There's a mixed picture emerging from the first results of Britain's referendum on its future in the EU. With only a small fraction of voting areas having declared, the outcome is simply too close to call. A final result will not be known for several hours. Here's our political correspondent, Eleanor Garnier, and her report contains some flash photography.
It was the moment polling stations closed. The UK had given its verdict. And the first result to declare Gibraltar with a decisive 96% vote in favour of Remain. Not long after, Newcastle with a narrow win for Remain.
65,404.
A much smaller win than expected. But in Sunderland, a huge win for Leave with 61%.
Votes cast in favour of Leave was...
Away from the north of England, in Basildon in Essex, another big win for Leave. And another count with a big turnout at 74%. At a Leave campaign party in London earlier in the night, the UKIP leader remained defensive.
Win or lose this battle tonight, we will win this war. We will get our country back, we will get our independence back, and we will get our borders back. Thank you.
very narrow, this...
It was a bruising campaign, and some say whether it's Leave or Remain, politicians need to do more to listen to the country.
Whatever the result of this, there'll be lessons that have to be learned by the Labour Party, but not just on the issue of immigration, a whole wider set of things for the Labour Party, but also for the government, you know, about what people are saying about the state of the country.
It's looking increasingly like turnout will be above 70% for the first time in a UK-wide contest since 1997. As results continue to come in, remember the referendum isn't decided count by count, but vote by vote. Eleanor Garnier, BBC News.
Well, following the first results, the pound fell dramatically, although it's regained some of those losses in the last hour. When the New York Stock Exchange closed, the pound was trading at just under $1.49. It fell at one point to $1.43, but has since recovered slightly. One currency analyst said traders are very jittery. The Italian Coast Guard said it rescued around 4,500 migrants in the Mediterranean yesterday. Good weather and calm seas have led to more people risking the journey from North Africa. The charity MSF has been helping the rescue operation. A woman's body was recovered from one of the vessels near the Libyan coast. A man has been jailed for life for plotting a beheading on the streets of London inspired by so-called Islamic State, which could have targeted a poppy seller. 23-year-old Nadir Saeed was arrested in November 2014, just days before Remembrance Sunday. One of the world's longest-running civil wars in Colombia has been brought to an end after more than 50 years of fighting. The so-called FARC rebels have signed a deal to lay down their arms following 3 years of negotiations. More than 200,000 people were killed during the conflict. Storms and heavy rain have caused serious flooding in parts of London and in southeast England. Several commuter and underground lines in the capital suffered severe delays and cancellations during the rush hour. Commuters suffered further chaos as they tried to get home in the evening. The UK's population grew by 500,000 last year. New figures show it's now just over 65 million. The Office for National Statistics says the increase is in line with the average population growth. Well, that's it. More from me soon.
Good. Well, welcome back to our coverage here of a very fascinating, complex, difficult to predict race on the referendum on Leave and Remain. The figures you saw a moment ago, 2.6 million for Leave, 2.7 million for Remain, but it absolutely means nothing at this stage because we've so much more to come in. We've only had 74 out of 382 counting areas in. We've got a number of things to talk about, what's happening in Wales, various other things, and what's happening in the Labour Party with John McDonnell. But let's just join Emily first.
David, thank you. I'm joined by Andrew Rawnsley and Isabel Hardman for the Observer Spectator. I've got to pull your eyes away from what's going on Channel 4 at the moment, some sort of Swedish porno.
No, I was watching the markets, I promise you. I was watching the market.
Thank goodness for that. You put me at rest. This is tantalisingly close at the moment. What do you think is going on in Downing Street, Isabel?
Well, I think there's quite a lot of panic in Downing Street, and I suspect there's also quite a lot of panic in a lot of Labour constituencies in the north, as well as they see their voters who they thought they were in step with turning away from them and voting out.
It's been very engaging, though. The weird thing about this is if turn-up is high, if the race is very close, it hasn't put people off
you
at
remember,
all.
no, you remember a lot of people at the beginning of the campaign were saying, ooh, how much do people really care? Most people about Europe, we know a minority of people care about it very passionately, but do they care that much? Well, at a lot of predictions, I remember turnout being very much lower than at a general election. Well, one thing, as you say, Emily, we don't know where we're going to be at 6 o'clock in the morning. But one thing we know is turnout's going to be higher than at a general election. And a lot of voters have obviously thought this is a very, very important moment, in whatever the result, a very important moment in our country's history, and I'm going to go and perform my civic duty.
John McDonnell was speaking a few minutes ago about the sense of a by-election, as if this was about austerity, as if this was about grievances, as if it wasn't about Europe. Do we not trust the voter to actually make this about Europe? What's your sense?
Well, I think most of the sort of public meetings that I've gone to and most of the people I've spoken to seem to be very engaged with the issues, even if it's the issues that Labour politicians like John McDonnell wouldn't like them to be engaged with, such as immigration. Actually, people aren't trying to stick two fingers up to the government. That they're actually trying to send maybe the elites a message about immigration and issues like that. But it is about the European Union, not about the UK government.
I would agree with this, but although you could say it is a by-election about the establishment, or the elites, as the outcome of tend to call them, because whatever happens tonight, even if Remain should edge it, about a half of the country will have listened to every major party leader except Nigel Farage, about three-quarters of the MPs in the House of Commons, and every professional body you can think of, from scientists to doctors to people in the arts world, who've always been advising them to vote in, and about half the country will have voted out.
And that half of the country, and where it is quite important. If, as is expected, London and Scotland are carrying the Remain vote, what does that tell you about the divide?
Well, and if their votes end up leading to an overall Remain vote, that will cause huge resentment in other parts of the UK, that there's a sort of Planet London, and there's already resentment between certain parts of the UK and Scotland, that actually the UK is already quite divided, and this will really add to that sense of grievance.
Although that would be true if it goes the other way, remember. I mean, you know, Scots, who are clearly going to, most of them to vote to stay, will be resentful, and it may lead in due course to another referendum on independence. We know, I mean, I think we're pretty clear, a lot of London is going to be majority in. I mean, London would have as much right, probably, to be resentful back towards England if the rest of England had forced us out, saying, well, you're cutting our throats and you're cutting your own, actually. So it could go both ways, that resentment.
How many party leaders do you think will have left their job by the end of this week?
You go first.
I think the Conservatives have tried very hard to make it clear that Cameron will stay on to steer the course if there is a Leave vote, but he will have to set out a clear timetable for his departure. I do detect serious movings against Corbyn, though.
I'd say maximum one. I don't think Jeremy Corbyn will be disappearing this week. If any party leader might be disappearing, or at least having to say, I'm going in due course, it will be David Cameron.
Thank you both very much indeed, David.
Just a reminder of how things are going. The North East, for instance, there's the percentage, 50%, 41%, 59%. 59 for Leave, 41 for Remain. And... but nice to have the percentages for, let's just go on a bit, Northwest. I'm mentioning the Northeast, the Northwest, 59%, 41% Remain. London so far, let's leave the raw figures and just see the percentage if we can. 31% Leave, it's running at 69% Remain. We've had Hammersmith and Fulham in. Hammersmith and Fulham, 70% for Remain and 30% for Leave. Now, we're joined by somebody who was Secretary of State for Wales until very recently, in fact, until Ian Duncan Smith walked out of Cabinet, and he became Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, Stephen Crabb. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Crabb. Is Wales proving a bit of a disappointment to the Remain campaign?
Well, I mean, it is early days, and we'll see what the rest of the night holds for us, but I'm not in any way surprised by these early results that we've seen for Wales. I felt for a number of years that the politics of Wales were being reshaped quite profoundly, and what you're seeing in the South Wales valleys and also in some of the North Wales Labour seats is the same phenomenon you're seeing in the northeast of England and in some of the other old industrial white working class areas of England. A large number of voters saying, sorry, we just don't believe the Labour Party or the government in the way they tell us that Europe and the European Union is good for us. And I think that's going to be one of the strong themes of tonight, is the way that the white working class Britain, certainly England and Wales, just haven't trusted the messages that we've been trying very hard to communicate about why staying part of the single market is so important for their jobs and for manufacturing and for revitalising these old industrial areas.
If at the end of the night we turn out to have a Brexit vote, the Chancellor of the Exchequer has said there's going to be an emergency budget. David Cameron said he's going to carry on with getting out of the EU. Do you think that both those things will happen? Will there be an emergency budget, or was that just a threat? And one of the things that may have put people off voting for Remain.
I think it's far too early to speculate what the outcome of the vote tonight will be. Other than that, we just know it's going to be very, very close. And clearly there's some quite deep divisions within the country in terms of the voting patterns. I spent most of today outside of London, actually in Wales. And when I arrived in London this evening, I'm afraid I didn't share the same buoyant feeling that some of my Remain colleagues did, who had spent the day in London campaigning and were reporting a very strong and positive message for Remain. So we've got to listen to what the messages are that are coming through from this referendum. But it's too early to speculate on what the outcomes and implications will be in terms of government actions to respond to what the scenario will look like tomorrow and the day after. But in terms of the leadership, I think it's absolutely essential that David Cameron stays on as Prime Minister. He has a clear mandate to be Prime Minister and to lead a government that provides stable governance for the country, and I think it's essential that he does that.
What about your failure to persuade Tory supporters in Wales to vote Remain?
Yeah, that's part of the similar picture. Don't forget, Wales is one of those parts of the UK that probably gets more European money than elsewhere, where a number of large manufacturers have located their plants and provided jobs, partly on the back of the European single market and certainly European assistance. But clearly, people up and down Wales haven't recognised the benefit of that for their own individual lives, and there isn't any kind of emotional attachment from the people of Wales towards the European Union. And you know, we'll spend the coming weeks and months asking questions about why that is. But clearly, politics in Wales has shifted. It looks a lot more like politics of the rest of England outside London, rather than the politics of Scotland, which people were comparing it to just a few years ago.
Well, thank you very much for that. John McDonnell, you're listening to that. I want to ask you a question about Labour. And Andy Burnham, who was a candidate for the leadership, has said the message to Labour from voters for Leave was, it should be, we've heard you, we understand what you're saying, we've got to change. Do you agree with that?
Yes, we've got to listen to our own...
Well, why haven't you been listening?
Well, we have been, I think...
Well, hang on, you can't say we've got to listen...
But they're telling it that we have been listening, but clearly people don't think we've listened enough, and we haven't come back on those issues that they've confronted us with.
So how would you come back on immigration?
I think what we have to do now is look at free movement of labour. We've been saying this through the campaign, but I don't think that message has got across. The issues that are on the doorstep with regard to immigration is the feelings that people are having their wages undercut, that there's pressure on public services, and there's a deep feeling of insecurity. Now,
what would you propose?
Well, in terms of free movement of labour, we've been arguing, and I don't think we've got the message across effectively, that we need to protect people from having their wages undercut. That means more employment rights. It means changes in some of the European Union directives, posted worker directive, for example. It does mean preventing agencies just recruiting outside of the UK, particularly types of workers. So that sort of, I think, employment rights approach is the one that would be protected. In terms of pressure on public services, we've said time and time again that the government was wrong to scrap the migration fund that was assisting areas where it came under particular pressure. And it does reflect, though, the austerity measures that the government have introduced. And a lot of the grievances that have come up with regard to immigration, I have to say, a reflection of what's happened in terms of austerity under this government. It is this government that's been cutting the NHS. It's this government that hasn't provided enough school places. So I think there's a whole debate to be had now, and we've got to say, yes, we are listening to what people are telling us.
It'll be a bit late, because you'll be out of the EU anyway, so all these things you're talking about, the posted workers directive and all the rest of it, will be irrelevant.
Whatever happens to the decision today, we have to have a new relationship with the European Union. Whether we're in or out, that relationship has to be negotiated. And some of these issues will be on the table.
John Mann, the Labour MP, is just joining us from Westminster in favour of leaving the EU. John, what would you say to Mr McDonnell about the way Labour handled this campaign?
Well, Labour was somewhat out of touch. And I'm surprised, David, you're not calling it for a Leave victory, because every single result that's come through was predictable. In the coalfields, where there are no results out yet, I predict it's going to be 2-1 for Leave. In my constituency, turnout was up 10% on the general election. And if you look at, even in Scotland, Dundee, the Scottish heartland for the SNP, every party in the Scottish Parliament voting for Remain, 40% voted to leave. Wales is going to vote a majority leave. Northern Ireland's going to vote a majority for leave. It leaves London, but if we take that Dagenham result, even in London, there's huge disparity. And Labour voters have decisively voted to leave the European Union.
Where
That
have
will be
Labour
the result.
got it wrong, then? I mean, let's not go into speculating whether, you know, you're right about all those places, Northern Ireland and the rest of it, and we'll have to wait and see what happens. But where has Labour gone wrong?
Well, Labour's gone wrong by not being in touch with its voters. I've been saying this for the last 10 years in relation to immigration and free movement of labour. I've been saying it in relation to what the offer is to working class people. It's not something new in this campaign. I'm not the only one, but it's a small number who've been saying it at the national level in Labour. I've said it for the last 10 years repeatedly.
And
what we're offering working class people is 0-hour contracts. What the country's offering, 0-hour contracts, agency work, insecurity, and people are sick to death of it. They've had enough. And that's why, in my area and elsewhere, Labour voters have voted in huge numbers to leave the European Union.
John McDonnell, do you think he's right in this critique of Labour?
I think John's right on a number of the policy issues, but on 0-hours contracts, we've already said we're going to scrap them altogether. In terms of insecurity at work, we've said we'll tackle the issue of the undermining of trade union rights in this country, and that means opposing the government's Trade Union Act. In addition to that, in terms of security, we want to have the workforce more involved in the planning of their company, represented on their company boards. So all of those issues that John has raised, we've actually got policies to deal with them. The issue for us now is how do we get those policies across? What's interesting is if you look at the shape of the vote tonight, is those areas that are not gaining in any way from the supposed recovery in the economy and have suffered economically over the last decade that are voting for leave. And I think that is, yes, it's a reflection of what they think about the European Union not assisting them, but I also think it's a reflection of a condemnation of the government's policies over the last 7 years when it comes to austerity. So there's real grievances out there which we think we've got the policies to address, and we need to get those across.
Theresa Villas, as a Brexiter, do you think he's right, that that's what you're winning, if you are winning, because of the failings of the Conservative government?
No, I think that the people who voted leave did so with a real understanding of the issues, that at the moment, as a member of the European Union, we do not govern our own affairs. It doesn't matter who you vote for at a devolved or a general election. There are many things that you cannot change, including free movement and immigration rules, and that's not healthy for our democracy.
So it's a constitutional matter for people, not what John is saying and John is saying, that people feel that they've been left behind and that they've had no... They've static wages for a long time, uncertainty about their jobs and all the rest of it.
People feel a lack of control overall. They feel not represented by the political elite, as they describe it, but they don't feel represented in Europe either. So they feel a lack of control over those very bread and butter issues about whether they can get a decent job, decent wages, roof over their heads and decent education for their children.
I think that when we've been talking to hundreds of voters in the last couple of months around the country, for lots of people, it's been a whole mixture of things. But people have really thought about these issues. They have engaged in it. They have thought about the European Union. It's been about identity. And, of course, that is a complex thing. So whatever, we're going to hear politicians say all sorts of things over the coming days. But voters have thought deeply about this, many of them. You can't just dismiss it and say it's one thing here or it's one reason. There's a whole conglomeration of reasons.
All right.
Many of them are about the European Union. It can't be dismissed just as something else.
We've got Liverpool in. Let's see the Liverpool figures. 85,000 leave and 118,000 remain. A much lower turnout, 64%, than we were getting from some other parts of the country. 42% leave, 58% remain. There we are. And the United Kingdom as a whole at the moment, it was there, but it's gone. Can we have that? Yes, there we are. This is how things are looking at the moment. Pretty well even. 3.7 million either side. 49.8, 50.2. We've had 103 of 382 of our counting areas in. Islington has just come in. Jeremy Corbyn's part of the world. 25,000 leave, 76,000 remain. 25 and 75%. So, John Mann, thank you very much for joining us. Let's go to you, Jeremy, and what have you got for us?
Well, I think we'll just collate some of the results and have a look at the map here. It's the time where we've got enough results that we can actually show you the map of the UK, and it's worth just taking in what the pattern is here. So here we see where Remain have come first in a counting area, they get yellow, where Leave have come first, they get their area coloured blue. And you see the immediate story here, a lot of yellow in Scotland. So if it does go at the end of the night to Remain, Scotland going powerfully for Remain and London as well will be the reasons. But of course, too early to talk like that, and it may well be going the other way. I can show you a heat map which just displays how powerful the support for Leave is. Now, on this map, to explain, where it is dark blue, Leave have had more votes. Where it is light blue, they've got much softer support. So you see immediately, Scotland, that situation underlined, where Leave is not really getting anything like the numbers it's getting elsewhere. And London as well. Can you see just down here in the southeast how light it is? Just here in the central London, those results we've had so far. But head out towards Essex, and suddenly the blues get darker here. And actually look at the whole of the map and just look at the amount of dark blue there is in the north, particularly the north of England, the northeast. That's how we started the night, with some remarkable results from the northeast. So Leave is packing a powerful punch in lots of places outside London and Scotland. But maybe London and Scotland will pull it back for Remain. Now, this is our proportional map, and what we show you here is each counting area as a stalk, and the stalk is coloured in the colour of the side that won. And the crucial thing is this: the height of the stalk shows you the winning margin. So, for example, here in Scotland, that's Glasgow, the highest stalk. You can see that Remain won there by a very large margin. But also, if you look down south, just reminds you of the sheer volume of votes available in London. That's Lambeth, that very tall one, and other results we've had from London, where Remain is winning with powerful results. But elsewhere, just come in close if you can for a moment and have a look at this map, this proportional map. You're seeing so many of these blue stalks. There are so many places where Leave is winning outside London and Scotland, and actually the margins of those Leave victories are really very powerful. So yes, there may not be as many voters outside London, but my goodness, the margins for Leave are making it very difficult for Remain to make up the ground. David.
Thanks, Jeremy. Castle Point we have in Essex, the main Canvey Island. I think one of the largest proportion of predominantly English white English-speaking people in the UK, and expected to go very much for Leave, and this is what Castle Point did. 37,000, 73% Leave, 27% Remain. Andrew Sinclair is in Chelmsford, political correspondent for the East, or the Eastern region. Andrew, hi there, good evening. Well, tell us what's happening in the East, as far as you can at the moment.
Well, we've just had that Castle Point result through as you join us. The East of England has always been seen as being a Eurosceptic area. We've got a very strong UKIP presence in this part of the world, particularly here in Essex. Of course, UKIP's only MP, Douglas Carswell, has his seat just down the road from here in Clacton. And 4 out of the 7 Euro MPs for the East of England have been in the Leave camp. So the expectation was that we'd always see quite a strong Leave vote here tonight, and indeed that's what we have been seeing. We had that result from Basildon a couple of hours ago now, 69% to Leave, Harlow 68%, Rochford 67%. They're counting Chelmsford behind me at the moment. At one stage, Remain thought there stood a good chance with Chelmsford. The expectation now is that Chelmsford could also go to Leave, and further afield I'm starting to hear stories coming out of places like Fenland, Great Yarmouth, Ipswich, that Leave could do very well there as well.
Thanks very much. Tim Donovan is in Guildhall. Tim, good evening. London, is it hacking it as far as the Remain campaign is concerned? Is it pulling its weight?
Is it 6 results out of 33 expected tonight? And there is a pattern emerging. Big, hefty wins for the Remain camp in Lambeth, in Wandsworth, here in the city itself, in Hammersmith, in Islington, and Barkingham-Dagenham, though, has gone to leave. We're trying to get our head round what we think will emerge as the significant factor here in London, which is the variations between in turnout. And while, you know, the Lambeth victory was 79% Remain to 21%, it was on a turnout of 67%, which is going to be lower than the turnout we're hearing elsewhere in parts of the country, albeit people are telling me, you know, that is high for that part of the world. The key issue appears to be, from the turnout figures we're getting so far, is that at places like Richmond, 82% turnout. We're going to be getting that result shortly, we're told. Harrow in the 70s, Bexley in the 70s, Croydon similarly. The turnout is higher in that outer London area, and all the polling up to this referendum in London had suggested that gap between Remain and Leave in London narrows dramatically in outer London, and that appears to be very much where you know, the secret or the answer in London will lie tonight.
And turnout affected at all by weather? People early on this evening were saying that this monsoon rain that London's been suffering and the flooding and all the rest of it has brought the turnout down, and that would affect the raw numbers of Remain, because we keep on reminding people it's not who wins where, it's actually, in the end, the number of people who vote one way or t'other.
Depends who you talk to. The returning officer here was saying earlier that he expected the turnout across London to be 74%, 75%, which is very high by London standards. It got into the early 80s back in 1950. There was a certain amount of disruption first thing this morning, but only 7 polling stations out of those 3,700 there are in London were actually disrupted, and very briefly. And it's not automatically clear that the weather has made a difference, and it may well be that actually people being delayed in London, as they were in Waterloo Station and whatever late this afternoon, that might have affected the turnout and the vote in areas outside of London, but it's not being blamed at this
come
stage.
in while you're talking. We've had Richmond upon Thames.
We have
come in 31% Leave, 69% Remain. Prosperous area, very high proportion of people, I'm told, with degrees. Apparently, people with degrees tend to vote Remain. Do you agree with that rather snobbish view, Teresa Villas sitting here, that people with degrees vote Remain?
Well, I think that's
do you have a degree?
I do have.
You do have a degree. Good for you.
I think that's what some of the pundits are saying. But
do you believe it? I mean, do you believe this? It's almost a kind of class division that has been established, isn't it? In the minds of psephologists, people with degrees better off vote Remain.
Well, I was in no doubt that there's a strong support for Leave amongst the working classes. I think they have, in many ways, been at the sharp end of the depression of wages, which has come from mass migration from Europe. So they have felt directly some of the difficulties that come with our EU membership. And I think that's one of the reasons why many of them are voting.
Could Labour have done any better, do you think, to get them out for their side?
Well, I don't know, because the trouble was that in the renegotiation, Europe's leaders were fundamentally opposed to significant changes to free movement. And once that decision was made, it's difficult for people to convince, you know, those who are concerned about immigration that it's possible to get things changed.
Laura?
But I think, Teresa Villas, you sound slightly hesitant about endorsing that theory that people who don't have degrees or who are less educated were more on your side. But in fact, the Out campaign absolutely went for that narrative. You built a whole narrative on this idea of David versus Goliath, the elites versus the working class, the gilded cage of London versus the rest of the country. And it appears so far the pattern of results suggests that that narrative really appealed to a lot of voters, and maybe they were onto something. They tried to make it a battle between the haves and the have-nots, and it appears still only halfway through the night. Are we halfway through the night yet? Maybe almost there. It appears that people are responding to that, and they didn't respond as strongly to the other side of the argument, which was trying to frighten the life out of people on the economy.
We're less than 1/3 through in terms of the count. You may feel it's halfway through the night because it's 3:05.
We're only just getting down to business, aren't we, really?
But of course, it also goes along with this contempt for, I mean, the thing Boris Johnson said, this contempt for experts.
Indeed. Michael
Where does
Gove
that
said
leave
people
us?
have had enough of experts.
We've had enough of the Governor of the Bank of England. We've had enough of the Institute for Fiscal Studies. We've had enough of the IMF. We've had enough of anybody who speaks we've had enough of economists.
But a fascinating thing that Stephen Crabb said a short while ago, people don't believe us. He even used that phrase. He was talking about white working class voters, and he said in a general context, people don't believe us, which it strikes me that's rather an astonishing thing for a member of the cabinet to say.
And how do you redress it?
That's an extremely difficult challenge. And if we end up, whatever the result is, whichever side is jubilant, if we end up where basically London has sort of been an island and the rest of the country is pointing fingers at saying, you don't listen, you don't understand, for any government, for any political party, it's going to be very difficult to find a way forward from that.
Patrick Burns is back, our political editor for the Midlands in Birmingham. Welcome back, Patrick. What more news have you got now?
Well, I think interesting developments really in the sense that, all right, no great surprise that places like North Warwickshire, Tamworth, Cannock on the outer edge of the conurbation have voted emphatically to leave. I think that was expected. But Malvern Hills, that was much less, according to those algorithms we've been talking about all evening, much less likely to vote leave. It has done by a comfortable majority of 53% to 47%. I think that's the real anxiety for the Remain campaign. Add to that the Remain campaign is braced for really substantial defeats in and around the Black Country. And one example of what's bound to be interpreted as the relative failure, frankly, of Labour to bring out their Remain support in core areas. Look at Sandwell, which is, well, it's jokingly referred to as a one-party state, and yet the turnout there, just 66%, which I think demonstrates what will be seen as Labour's failure there. And I can tell you, UKIP are going to be saying over the next few days that they stand ready to do to Labour in their core areas in England what the SNP have done to Labour's support in Scotland. I was talking to one quite prominent local Labour MP who says that on the immigration issue, Labour has to change tack. It has to say to people, yeah, we get it. We realise that you're very concerned about immigration, that it doesn't make you a racist to have these anxieties, and to change the tenor of this debate rather than try to sort of present it in more simple, more traditional party terms.
Well,
so I think that there's some big questions.
But
there.
if Britain votes out, they've got all the mechanisms they want because there'll be no automatic EU immigration. So presumably John McDonnell and Jeremy Corbyn will be able to do what they want.
Yes, I think there is a debate here for the Labour Party. I think we're just at the beginnings of this. Interestingly, that turnouts, again, do seem to be lower in the traditional core Labour areas. That's, again, a big worry for the party's leadership, it seems to me.
4,389,000 for Leave, 4,354,000 for Remain at the moment. And we have 122 out of 382 declared, so it is only a third of the way through. Emily.
Let's talk to the Conservative MP, Bill Cash. I suppose we might call you an early Eurosceptic, Bill Cash, and when you look at where we are tonight, a third of the votes in, but let's call it a high possibility that it could be a Brexit by the end of the night. What are your thoughts?
Well, I'm watching it with enormous interest, and I'm being extremely cautious because at the moment things are going very steadily in the right direction. I actually believe this is about the common sense of the British people. They didn't buy the Armageddon arguments. And above all else, they want to govern themselves. And that's really the basis. Even when I set up the Maastricht referendum campaign all those years ago. That's what I said it was going to be about European government and whether or not the British people wanted to govern themselves. And I actually think that that is coming through at the moment. But I'm not going to make any predictions. I'm not a John Curtis. I'm just going to wait and see.
There's only one John Curtis, as we shout in the stalls. But in terms of what you think might happen in the event of a Brexit. Do you think that David Cameron should stay on? Would you like him to trigger Article 50 straight away? What do you see as the next step?
Well, I certainly don't think that we should trigger Article 50 straight away. Actually, it ties us right into the question of the consent of the European Parliament to the deal. There's majority voting. It puts us at an enormous disadvantage. And by the way, because it's passed the Lisbon Treaty, if we've just voted against the treaties, then why would we want to implement one of the provisions which ties us down when actually we've got a better opportunity to be able to work out a negotiated deal on the basis of the vote which has actually led to a Brexit, if that's what happens?
You skirted past the first bit of that question. Do you think David Cameron should stay in the job? Did he sign the letter?
I simply say this, that it is incredibly difficult if you're in number 10 with all the government departments, each one of which reports to the Cabinet Secretary and, of course, obviously dealing with the Cabinet Office as well. As Chairman of the European Scrutiny Committee, I'm extremely conscious of the interaction between government departments and the European issue. And I can simply say this, it has to be done from within number 10, and therefore whoever is in number 10 would need to be absolutely and completely committed to Brexit, because this is going to be a very, very, very important and historic development for the United Kingdom.
It wouldn't be odd for you to reckon on a Brexit campaigner, a Tory leader.
Well, look, I'm not going to go down there because we don't know what the result is. I'm just simply giving you my view as Chairman of the European Scrutiny Committee and making the point that, as far as I'm concerned, the question of who runs the ultimate European policy has to be in number 10, and to do that and to negotiate with all the implications for European legislation right the way across the board of all government departments, they will actually have to unravel about 55% of all our laws, because those come from the European Union.
We've heard from the Labour side people throwing up different ideas as to why, particularly in the North East, in Sunderland and Newcastle, it seems to be such a strong vote towards Brexit. Do you think this is purely about Europe, or do you concede it's about a whole host of other dissatisfactions in people's lives?
Well, I think they interact. And you only have to look across to Europe itself to see there are protests and riots going on there. There is massive unemployment, youth unemployment up at 60% and so on. But I think actually, really and truly, the bottom line is this business of people wanting to govern themselves. I mean, I was talking to a lady this morning in the greengrocer's shop, and I said, you know, what are you intending to do? And she said, very, very simply, she said, I want to leave. Why did they die in the last war? That is the kind of thing that's also motivating a lot of people. They want to know whether in fact they can govern themselves, and they ask themselves these much deeper questions than some of the things about whether or not there is a shallow recession, as the IFS puts it, or whatever. It's actually much deeper than that, and I think this is the soul of the British people coming out and saying we have actually had enough of being governed by other countries. We want to cooperate with them, we want to trade with them, but we don't want to be governed by them. And I think there is a German question as well, because they're becoming increasingly dominant in Europe, and I think that's also a factor.
OK, Sir Belkash, thank you very much.
So let's just see where things are. 3:15, John Curtis. Where are things?
Well, we've seen quite a lot of results during the course of the night whereby it looks as though the Leave side have been doing rather well, and certainly rather better than we expected they would do in that local authority if we were looking at a 50-50 outcome. Now, conversely, we've also seen some places, most notably in London, where the Remain side have been doing rather better. But the truth is that so far, at least, we've had many more places where Leave are doing better than expected than where Remain are doing better than expected. Particularly the North East, the North West and the West Midlands are places where the Leave side really do seem to be doing rather remarkably well. Remain, yes, in London, rather better than we expected, perhaps in the South West. But those better performances in London, so far at least, just don't look to be sufficiently better than we were expecting to compensate for what appear to be rather adverse performances in the northeast, northwest, and the West Midlands. Now, the truth is there's still an awful lot of votes to come in. We've only, although we've got a lot of local authorities that have come in so far, the relatively small ones. But certainly, one, we are looking at a close referendum. But two, probably at the moment, the Leave side are a bit more of the favourites in this referendum than are the Remain side. So that's not a forecast, but it certainly seems to be the direction of travel. Perhaps the Leave side just managing to win this referendum by the end of the night, but many more results to come.
And just to clarify it for people who may just have come in on this act, your expectations were based on 50-50, in other words, on absolute even results.
That's right.
So if your expectations are disappointed one way or the other,
yes,
it means it's going to go one way or the other.
Well, that's the current direction of travel. Now, we never expected all our expectations to work perfectly. Of course, they wouldn't. The point is, we, at the moment at least, have more places where Leave are doing better than we expected than we have places where Remain were doing better than expected. And certainly if that pattern continues during the night, then Leave are going to win this referendum. But, of course, there's an awful lot more yet to come.
Hilary Benn is here, Shadow Foreign Secretary, and Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Conservative MP for North East Somerset. Hilary Benn, 41 years ago, I sat with your dad.
Indeed?
Indeed. I think probably on referendum night. And he said the problem with the EU was it's undemocratic. Is what we're seeing tonight the British electorate catching up with him? Because in those days, it was 2/3, 1/3.
It was.
And now it's looking 50-50, if not a bit the other way.
Well, I'm tempted to say it's not yet late enough to know, which is a different way of saying it's too early to say. But look, what is quite clear, watching the results come in this evening and this morning, is one leads and then the other. I think what's happening is the country is split absolutely down the middle on this. And it's partly to do with the EU, it's partly to do with other changes that people have seen, concerns they have, the continuing effect of the global crash, the way in which communities have changed, immigration, all of those things, and they're bound up in this referendum. But yes, of course, I met people on the campaign trail and talked to a lot of them who said, we want to take our own decisions. The argument is, how do you best influence what happens in the world, in which there's some things you have to decide on a European level.
Was it wrong to have the referendum at all?
Well, we didn't want the referendum because we're not in favour of leaving, but the Conservatives won the election, and the British people are now going to make the choice.
Was it a mistake to have this referendum?
Well, I don't think so, no, particularly as it currently looks as if we may win. So if we win, it was a great thing to have the referendum.
Do you think it's the right way of deciding things as important as this? Just a straight... I mean, as Hilary Benn is saying, and many other people are saying, it doesn't become an issue about the EU. It becomes about poverty, it becomes about discontents of all kinds.
I don't agree with that. I think
it's not about what you pretend it's about.
No, most of this debate was about the European Union. The Remain side said it was about being economically attached to Europe and said that was beneficial. The Leave side said that it was a lack of democracy, a lack of control, and the issue with immigration. Most of the debate has focused on the European Union. And it seems to me that the one area where referendums are absolutely right are on constitutional matters, because the one thing Parliament can never do is give away its own power. That has to be returned entire to the electorate every 5 years. Within that 5 years, there is discretion to act, but the power must be returned to the voters for each general election. And the problem with the European Union is that power has steadily eroded and been given away to unelected officials in Brussels.
But you don't have to ask this kind of question. And indeed, you could leave the EU by dint of general elections. And having a party that in the... You know, if UKIP formed a government and said we're leaving, you could do it that way.
If you take the view that sovereignty comes from the British people and is delegated to Parliament for 5 years, which is, I think, a pretty traditional view of parliamentary sovereignty, then you would agree, I think, that the one thing where the people must be consulted is when their absolute powers are given away or there's a fundamental change in the Constitution. And leaving the European Union would be a fundamental constitutional change.
Well, joining was a fundamental constitutional
and
change.
It had a referendum.
And that had a referendum.
It had a referendum 3 years late. It should have had one in advance.
But it had one in 75, so no particular reason to call another one now.
But as so often, our constitutional practice is developing, and the theory of referendums was not well developed by 1973. It developed through 1979 with the referendums in Scotland and in Wales. Likewise, in the devolution referendums and the referendum for the Mayor of London in the late 1990s, the referendum on the alternative vote. the British Constitution over many centuries has evolved, and one of the evolutions over the last 40, 50 years is that the biggest constitutional issues are referred to the people. And I think that's a very sensible way to proceed.
If you decide there's a need for a constitutional issue to be resolved.
That's right.
Which you don't necessarily decide. But you think it's a mistake, Hilary Benn, to have had this referendum. Do you think that one of the consequences is that what appeared to be, as Jacob Rees-Mogg puts it, a constitutional issue, has actually attracted all kinds of discontents and turned it probably not into a constitutional issue, but a view about, you know, we heard about experts being, we don't like the Governor of the Bank of England, we don't like the Institute of Fiscal Studies, we don't like the IMF, we don't like our wages, we don't like the insecurity, we don't like immigration. All these things got bundled together. So it's not actually about the Constitution, it's about all these other things.
Well, look, let's be absolutely clear why we had this referendum. It's because David Cameron realised that he couldn't control his party. That's why we had this referendum. And as you will know, this is 41 years ago repeated, but in mirror image. Because 41 years ago, the Labour Party, the Labour movement was split on Europe, and the Conservatives were united, and they've passed each other in the intervening 41 years and now are occupying the same position, but the opposite. And David Cameron, who had resisted having a referendum, decided in the end, the only way I can manage my disputatious and divided party is to hold the referendum, and we will discover in the not-too-distant future what the British people have
3 hours, 3 hours from now, with a bit of luck.
Something like that.
Jacob Rees-Mogg, during the course of all this, you said about your Chancellor of the Exchequer, he needs to calm down and stop talking nonsense. Do you think he should go?
What I was referring to was when he suggested that there should be an emergency budget,
yes,
which was an absolute panic measure. And George Osborne is a fine Chancellor. He has done a lot of good things as Chancellor. But that panic budget was a really very silly thing to say. And he did need to calm down. It was something that wouldn't happen, wouldn't get through Parliament, and wouldn't be the right economic response, even if a Chancellor tried to propose it. So I thought that was a foolish thing for him to have said.
And all right to insult him in that way, like you insulted Heseltine and John Major. Humbug and whatever it was, frightful humbug and vengeful men and all
Well, I only responded to what they had said about people on my side. It was a fair old tit-for-tat, which you get in political campaigns. I don't think there's any great harm in that.
If tomorrow morning we wake up, well, we will be awake tomorrow morning, so it's...
we already are.
I am awake pretty well. And Britain is to leave. Do you think all that stuff about emergency budgets will go by the board? Do you think none of the economic problems that the Chancellor foresaw will come to pass?
I do not think they will come to pass. I think the emergency budget will not happen. There's some volatility in the foreign currency markets. They're on very thin trading in Australasia overnight. You would expect volatility in sterling, and sterling is one of the automatic stabilisers of the economy. I don't think that's a particular problem. No, the plague of frogs and the death of the firstborn that were being predicted during the campaign are not going to happen.
No recession?
There will be no recession because of Brexit, though there's fragile economic conditions in other parts of the world. So I can't say no recession ever, but not caused by Brexit specifically.
Hilary Benn, do you agree with that?
Well, look, all of the experts whom we're told now that we shouldn't pay much attention to seem to be of the view, and certainly we argued it during the referendum campaign, that the country will be worse off economically. One of a very strong argument for remaining in the European Union. Now, the extent of that, who knows? It depends on the result. But look, I think if there were to be a vote to leave, then as far as the Prime Minister is concerned, I don't see how he's going to remain in his job for very long at all.
What does very long at all mean?
Well, I think it's very hard for him in those circumstances, were that to be the outcome, for him to remain.
John Mann, Labour MP, said that by the time the children were going to school in the morning, he'd have gone.
Well, I don't know about that, but I think, look, if you are the Prime Minister, you have called this referendum, you've laid your reputation on the line and your arguments. I think it's going to be very hard, but I'm hoping very much that we get a Remain vote and it continues to ebb back and flow as we watch the results come in.
Laura.
Hilary Benn, are you frustrated as the Shadow Foreign Secretary, somebody who's passionately for the European Union, that Labour came rather late to the party, shall we say?
Well, as Tom Watson, I think, was saying when he was on earlier, it was quite difficult to start with to break into the Conservative fight that was going on. It really was very, very tough. And we got more of a chance towards the end. But can I just say that all the indications thus far, we'll have to see the final result, is that a majority of Labour supporters we think, will have voted for Remain. The problem party is for the Conservatives. Will the Prime Minister be able to say that? I somehow doubt it.
Well, there are lots of other problems. Will you stay with us and we may be able to talk a bit more, but we have to move on to just see how things stand and how far we've got to go. Here is the House of Commons as dawn comes up, not quite, 3:25. And this is the vote. The centre there is the winning post, the red dotted line. And it's 6 million Leave at the moment and 5.8 million Remain. So Leave has the edge, and the grey bit is, of course, the bit that has got to be filled in. Let's go to some more of our reporters. We go back to Steve Godden in Falkirk. Steve.
David, the local business here in Falkirk is finished. All that remains is for people to get up on that stage behind me and to announce the national result here in Scotland. Now, in Falkirk, it very much followed the pattern that it has across Scotland. It was a vote to Remain. Within that, some of the numbers, I think, came as a bit of a surprise to people, but we're expecting Edinburgh to announce imminently. Very much the expectation there is that Edinburgh will vote to Remain in large numbers. We also saw in Glasgow a vote almost 2-1 in favour of Remain. Now, there, the interesting thing was turnout. We've had a national figure for turnout in Scotland, that is just over 67%, but in Glasgow, that figure was 56%. That's much below the level of support and the level of involvement and engagement that we saw during the independence referendum 2 years ago. Also, across the picture, I mean, there was an expectation that things were looking a bit patchy at one stage. Certain areas that may have been a bit more sceptical about the EU, an area like Moray, for example, but Moray voted to Remain. So now we only have a handful left, well over the 3/4 mark here in Scotland, councils that have declared, and all have voted in favour of Remain. So how that fits in to the national picture will be fascinating.
Thank you very much, Steve. Let's join Mark Devonport now in Belfast. Mark.
David, the count here is being conducted according to the 18 parliamentary constituencies. We're well through the count with 14 constituencies declared. We're just waiting on 4 results. At the moment, Remain is in the lead in Northern Ireland. That was to be expected. We think it's a breakdown of about 54% to 46%. And because it's been unionists, by and large, who've been supporting the Leave camp and nationalists who've been supporting the Remain camp, we would predict that at least 3 of the 4 constituencies that are to come, which are nationalist constituencies, will probably vote for Remain, and therefore they will probably stretch that lead slightly. So I wouldn't expect anything other than a Remain vote here, but it has to be said that nationalists haven't come out in the numbers that maybe have been expected previously. We've had some lower turnouts in nationalist areas, so that might mean that the level of the victory that Remain takes in Northern Ireland is less than expected. At the moment, there are about 40 to 50,000 votes in the lead.
Thanks very much, Mark. And now James Williams in Wales, in Deeside. James. James, you have the conch.
Hello, I hope you can hear me.
Yes,
Sorry,
we can hear you fine.
we're getting a lot of results coming through here in Wales, so we're trying to keep an eye on them. So far, we've had most of the declarations. We've just got some 4 left, 18 declarations out of 22, and so far we've had 3 for Remain. Surprisingly, Monmouthshire has just voted by the narrowest of margins for Remain. That is a very conservative area. David T.C. Davis, one of the more vociferous proponents for Brexit. He represents the seat in Parliament, and that is a surprise result. Vale of Glamorgan has also voted for Remain. That's Alan Cairns, the Welsh Secretary's seat, and Ceredigion is the other seat that has voted for Remain in West Wales, but very small population there. So 4 left to declare: Torfaen, Gwynedd, Cardiff and Powys. And of those, we're expecting Gwynedd and Cardiff to vote for Remain. And quite frankly, it seems at the moment, given the way things have been going, that it all comes down to how large the majority for Remain in Cardiff is. It seems at the moment, from the soundings I'm getting from people in Cardiff, that they don't think that they've done enough, that the margin isn't big enough to make up the shortfall that they currently have. But we just have to wait and see what happens in Cardiff, and it seems that it'll all hinge on that as to how Wales as a whole votes.
Thanks very much indeed, James. The Leave campaign is now, if you look at the top right or the bottom right-hand corner there, is ahead by just over 300,000. Jeremy, should we see how things are settling, if they are?
Yeah,
it's quite volatile still, isn't it?
Well,
really?
it is, and our index is actually proving very, very handy in working out what's going on. Yeah, that is a relief. So we put all these areas into the order of how Eurosceptical they were, just to go back on this ordering from the most Leave all the way over there to come this way to the most Remain over here. And the calculation is done on this basis, and this is really important. Were there to be a 50-50 vote across the whole country, where the dotted line is, over there, would be 50-50. So those particular counting areas would be absolutely 50-50. So what we're looking for is areas where yellow for Remain pops up where you're expecting blue for Leave, or vice versa. And so far, we've had some very interesting results up this end. Just come with me if you can, and I'll show you. So these are the areas that we would expect to be going Remain in a very, very even result. And most of them are. But you can see there, and we've heard these results, Lincoln, Swansea, Coventry, Watford, places which we thought would go Remain in the event of a 50-50 result, actually going Leave. Now, Remain's response to that has to be to pile up votes in their strongest areas. They are hampered by a lower than expected turnout in Scotland, and whether they can do that in London is going to be the crucial question of the night. Now, take a look at this. I'm showing you regions. Regions of the UK, nations and regions. We'll start from the right here, and the colour at the top is the winning colour. So in London, Remain have won. The proportion as well on the bar is important. In London, Remain won by a lot. In Scotland, Remain have won by even more proportionately. So far, this is just what we've got in so far. Northern Ireland, again, Remain in the lead, although by less. Now, in Wales and the rest of England, just look at this. So these are the regions. Southwest, you can see southeast, northwest, Yorkshire and the Humber, northeast, West Midlands, East of England, East Midlands, and Wales, all going for Leave. Now, if that isn't a portrait of a divided country on this one issue, I don't know what is. That is almost the most dramatic portrait you could have of what's going on tonight. And if Remain do win, it will be Scotland and London that keep the UK in the EU. But it looks at the moment as though the drift is towards blue. What have we got so far? Always worth emphasising, so many more votes to count. Let me just show you, if I can. We'll go back to our index for just a second, and I'll bring on the votes we've got so far. Let's bring the camera up to the ceiling. There we go. Look at the grey. That's all the counting that still has to be done. But you can see 6.4 million Leave, 6.1 million Remain. Bring it back down. And it's so poised, isn't it? I guess if you're watching at home on TV, you're not going to go to bed anytime soon. Wow, David.
We've turned Broadcasting House into the equivalent of Times Square or Piccadilly Circus tonight. I don't know what the old building makes of it, but there we are. We've got the figures on the front of it showing how things stand at the moment, running through the night. And it's showing 51.3% for Leave, 48.7% at the moment for Remain. Still, we're saying it's too early to call, which is obvious from what we've been saying. There's no point in calling it until it's safe to call. So those are the figures. And it's time for a roundup of the news. So, once again, here's Rita Chakrabarti.
Thank you, David. Well, the results emerging from the UK's referendum on the EU so far show a very close contest between the Leave and Remain votes. Leave is consistently doing better than predicted in vast swathes of the country. Remain is performing better in London and Scotland, suggesting potentially a very divided UK once all the votes are counted. Here's our political correspondent, Eleanor Garnier, and her report contains some flash photography.
It was the moment polling stations closed. The UK had given its verdict. And the first result to declare Gibraltar, with a decisive 96% vote in favour of Remain. Not long after, a flurry of good results for Leave in the north of England. In Newcastle, Remain only managed a narrow win.
65,404.
a much smaller victory than expected. And in Sunderland, Leave had a huge win with 61%.
Votes cast in favour of Leave was...
Away from the north of England, in Basildon in Essex, another big win for Leave. And another count with a big turnout at 74%. But there was good news for Remain in the London borough of Lambeth, with 79%, a much better result than expected. Though overall, it's looking very tight indeed.
I think it's going to be extremely close. And there is a disaffected vote, and it's disaffected with politics overall, disaffected with Westminster politics in particular. Some of that is our Labour supporters too, and we've done our best to try and turn that round, but it's been tough.
At a Leave campaign party in London earlier in the night, the UKIP leader remained defensive.
We don't lose this battle tonight. We will win this war. We will get our country back. We will get our independence back. And we will get our borders back. Thank you.
It's looking increasingly like turnout will be above 70% for the first time in a UK-wide contest since 1997. As results continue to come in, remember the referendum isn't decided count by count, but vote by vote. Eleanor Garnier, BBC News.
Well, early results have upset the world's financial markets. The pound initially soared as polls closed, but then it suffered its third largest fall on record, plummeting from about $1.50 to almost $1.40 as results began to show stronger than expected support for leaving the EU. More recently, the pound has recovered, but the markets are still volatile. The Italian Coast Guard says it rescued around 4,500 migrants in the Mediterranean yesterday. Good weather and calm seas have led to more people risking the journey from North Africa. The charity MSF has been helping the rescue operation. A woman's body was recovered from one of the vessels near the Libyan coast. President Obama has suffered a setback in his plan to spare millions of people living illegally in the US from deportation. The Supreme Court has blocked the reforms, with the opinion of 8 justices split equally. Mr. Obama called the ruling heartbreaking. A man has been jailed for life for plotting a beheading on the streets of London inspired by so-called Islamic State, which could have targeted a poppy seller. 23-year-old Nadir Saeed was arrested in November 2014, just days before Remembrance Sunday. One of the world's longest-running civil wars in Colombia has been brought to an end after more than 50 years of fighting. The so-called FARC rebels have signed a deal to lay down their arms following 3 years of negotiations. More than 200,000 people were killed during the conflict. Well, that's all for now. More from me in a little while.
The result from Edinburgh, 64,498 leave, 187,796 remain, 26% to 74%. That's the largest part of Scotland, apart from Glasgow, the largest number of voters. And a lot of people, incidentally, with degrees. I don't know whether you agree with this thing, Jacob Rees-Mogg, because you're a reasonably well-educated fellow. But they've been saying all along that the educated people vote to remain and the people who don't have qualifications vote to leave. What do you make of that? You've been hearing this.
I have been hearing this.
Insulting, isn't it?
No, I don't think so. I mean, people do these surveys and they come to these conclusions, and clearly they've come to the conclusion that people with degrees have not been backing Brexit. But you're the exception to the rule. The exception to the rule. And I think it's very interesting. I think this has been basically an insurgent campaign. It has been a campaign against the establishment. And I think this is important because there is a feeling that the rulers of this country have got out of touch with those who elect them. And I think this applies across Europe, and I think Europe is at the heart of this, because there are so many things that British politicians can no longer do because the laws are made in Brussels. And we slightly carry the can for this, because when voters are concerned, we can't change it. And so I think that disconnect between the elected and the electors has widened through the EU, and this is a kickback against it. And that's why I think people furthest from the establishment have been the most likely to vote leave. And I say this without beginning to deny that I am a copper-bottomed member of the establishment. I just happen to agree with the anti-establishment tribe on this.
If it's very close, either way, is it going to lead to a great sense of disaffection by the losing side? Because they have been asked to make a sort of Manichaean choice. What do you think, Hillary? I mean, there'll be the people who've lost out one way or the other. Will they be difficult to satisfy, difficult to please? They're going to find something that they obviously believe in just taken away like that.
Whichever way it goes, there's going to be a great deal of disappointment and sorrow on the path of the losing side. And one of the challenges that society will face, politics will face, is how do you try and heal the divisions that have been created by what has been a lively and at times a feisty debate. And I fear that if there is further disappointment on the part of those who thought they were voting to get something and then it doesn't appear, that it will be even more difficult to manage. Now, I think we have to try and address the root cause.
Sorry, which are those? The Brexiters?
Well, look, for example, if Leave were to win, and then if you look at the issue of migration, a lot of the Leave campaigners have said, well, there will continue to be a need for migration into the country for a whole host of reasons, skills and the economic contribution that they make. But the real task will be to try and heal the divisions that this referendum has created, and that is a responsibility on all of us to make that happen, and to reflect, each in our own party, about what it is we now need to do to play our part in ensuring that...
Of course, the Leave side never put any number on its control of immigration, did it? Unlike the Prime Minister, incidentally, who did, and your party, who did put it. The Leave campaign never said, never gave a figure at all, 100,000, nothing. They didn't say, just said we'll have control of it.
That's a very important point, because it's a referendum, not a general election. And the Leave campaign could only put forward broad outlines of what it thought ought to be done.
Oh, come on, it took VAT off fuel, it had all sorts of things it was going to do.
A mandate coming from the British people, that in a general election you can set out policies on every last detail of what you want to do, and then if you win an election, you have a duty to implement them because you've got a majority in the House of Commons, you can pass the legislation. But in a referendum, you can't put forward a detailed manifesto with any realistic prospect of getting it through. So yes, some suggestions were made that we could take VAT off fuel, but as the Leave campaign will not be the government, even if we win this vote, it's going to be up to the government to look at the mandate that it's been given.
Should Cameron go for a new, go for an election and go for a new mandate? Briefly, if you would, because we have to...
I wouldn't rule out a new election altogether.
In this autumn?
Well, it's complicated under the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, but it's not impossible.
You could just change the Act.
You could just change the Act, or there are ways around it. A new general election is not impossible.
Right. Thank you very much. We're just going to rejoin or bring Scotland back to join us and Wales to join us, who've been briefly away looking at their own events. Here we are. So we've had 200 out of 382 in. We've just had we've had Edinburgh in I gave, County Durham, 153,000 leave, 100,000 remain. Can we just see those two? Yes, thank you very much. 58% leave, 42% remain. And Jacob Rees-Mogg has just been saying he doesn't rule out an early election in order to get a mandate to get things moving again.
Well, there will be a lot of policy changes that need to come about if we leave the European Union, that inevitably areas that have been controlled by the European Union will now be controlled by us, and they will be a matter for natural political debate. So I don't think it's impossible. It really depends on what the response is in Parliament and by the government to this.
Hilary Benn, do you expect an election?
Well, I mean, that depends on the result of the referendum and who is Prime Minister once we know what the result is. I mean, it would be in the hands of the government if they decided they wanted to do one. But I think the public might say, well, hang on, we had an election not all that long ago. Why are we having another one? Because we've made a decision about Europe in the referendum. It's government's job to get on and govern, and it's our job to hold the government to account.
Although earlier, Hilary Benn, you said that David Cameron would be almost straight out on his ear if he lost the referendum, and that, for a lot of voters, might think...
Sure, well, that may or may not result in a general election. Clearly, if he did leave as Prime Minister, well, then it would result in a new Prime Minister arriving. But that's a problem for the Conservative Party, not for me.
John Curtis, Leave are now ahead by nearly 500,000. Is that significant? I mean, it's a lead of 500,000. Statistically, from your point of view, would you expect that to fall, or is that going to grow?
Well, I think the truth is, I mean, the crucial thing that I'm looking at, David, is that, you know, there are some places where the Remain side are doing better than we expect according to the index. But for every one of those that I can see, I've got between 2 and 3 places where the Leave side are doing better than we expect. So you can see that the balance is one, it certainly doesn't look like anything other than a close result, but certainly that tally that says that Leave are ahead is a tally which is telling you something. It is that indeed Leave do seem to be ahead, and that at the moment at least, though it's by no means definite, they are the favourites to be ahead at the end of the night. So yeah, that number is something you should look at, because actually that it seems to be the direction in which we are heading, unless the second half of this referendum night is very different indeed from the first half.
You're being very cautious, John.
Well, you know, David, we don't wish people to get the wrong impression. And the truth is, there's a lot of uncertainty about things. There's more than half the votes to come in. A lot of the local authorities to come in early on are the relatively smaller local authorities. But again, you know, if I were Remain side, I'd be worrying about the fact that they've lost in Sheffield, Coventry, Wolverhampton. You know, relatively large local authorities are going towards Leave. So, you know, we certainly can't say that, you know, it's definitely going to be Leave going to win, because the truth is we're looking at a pretty narrow referendum. But just to reiterate, it does look as though the Leave side are favourites, and that the conversation you've just been having with your 2 politicians about what would happen in the event of a Leave vote, shall we say, I think is no longer a purely academic one.
James Landale is at the Remain headquarters. James, we heard earlier that the Prime Minister's staff... Are you hearing me all right? I think you're not hearing me because you're looking for something. Oh, you're not attached. Oh, right. You're... Nick Watt, Nick, you're there, good. You are connected from the Leave campaign. They seem pretty confident there. Do you think what John Curtis was saying about it's still, you know, it's too early to call and all that, do they believe that, or do they believe they've won?
Well, the Leave.eu people, it's fair to say, a lot of drink has been taken. You heard another cheer there. They are very, very confident. It was interesting, I was talking to a senior UKIP figure, and this UKIP figure looked almost shell-shocked and said, what have we done? I think we may have pulled it off. Because, of course, Nigel Farage was saying earlier on this evening that he didn't think he was doing it, but now his aides are saying they think they may have got them across the line. But, of course, Leave.eu is not the official Leave campaign. That's Vote Leave, which is across the river, and they, too, are sounding increasingly confident. Matthew Elliott, the chief executive of Vote Leave, he's just said he's cautiously optimistic, and a source that I've been talking to at Vote Leave says, yes, we've seen those London results, but we think we can overcome them because we are smashing Remain everywhere else in the country. And it's interesting, you know, that Vote Leave are not having a party this evening. They say they've got more important things to spend their money on. It's called getting the vote out. And also, there's that political decision, which is those cabinet ministers at the top of the Vote Leave group, Michael Gove, Boris Johnson, they are, at the moment at least, supporting the Prime Minister. And the plan is we will not hear from Boris Johnson and Michael Gove until after the Prime Minister has given either his concession or his victory speech. But what I'm hearing in Whitehall are very, very, very severe nerves. Been in contact with one senior source who said, oh, and then I won't repeat the words to you, David, there, and then he said this wasn't meant to happen. And I said, look at the pound, that's been going down. And this source said to me, if this carries on like this, everything is going to go through the floor in the morning.
Thank you very much, Nick. Let's go back to James Landale at the Remain headquarters. We heard earlier that Cameron's staff had left, presumably to go into conclave somewhere and decide what to do. Is that so? Or is there a party atmosphere?
Yeah, that's
it doesn't
right.
look much like a party atmosphere, I have to say.
No, it's not. I mean, at the beginning of the evening, this was buzzing. This place was full of cabinet ministers, Labour front benchers. We had former Liberal leaders. We even had a visitation from the comedian Eddie Izzard in a rather fetching pink beret. They've all gone. This place has thinned out completely. I don't know if you can have a look now, but I don't think you could describe this as positively buzzing. It's like that moment, David, at a drinks party when you suddenly look up and you realise that most people have gone and there's a real danger that you're going to be the last person
left on the floor, James.
If you talk to the strategists here, if you talk to the strategists here, David, they say, look, it's still doable, it's still possible. Look to some of the results in London, Birmingham's got to come in, Manchester, but they admit they have to win really, really big now there. So, you know, that might be just a little bit of realism, a little bit of, you know, wishful thinking, but that is what they're thinking at the moment. But a lot of long faces here.
Thanks very much. Just a question to you two. When Harold Wilson had this referendum in '75, he was quite careful not to be the sort of leader of the let's stay in. I mean, he signed a thing saying we want to stay in, but he didn't go around campaigning. He kept back, rather, so that if he lost, he could have carried on and government would have continued. Do you think that David Cameron made a mistake by becoming so totally involved after his negotiation in Brussels in being cheerleader for the Remain campaign, rather than saying, I've done my best, here you are, now you decide?
Yes, I do, on balance. I think it would have been better if he had been rather more Olympian in his approach and had risen above it. I think it would have made the issues of reuniting the Conservative Party afterwards easier. Having said that, he was in a difficult position because he is the most popular figure on the Remain side. He has a lot of influence, and he had made the decision that we should have a referendum. So it wasn't an easy choice for him to make, but on balance, I think it would have been better for him to have been more impartial.
Let's go to our Asia business correspondent, Karishma Vaswani, who joins us from Singapore. I can't think what time it is in Singapore right now, but what has been the reaction of people in Singapore and the markets?
Well, across Asian markets, there's a real sense of anxiety. Just in the last few minutes, we've seen the pound fall to levels not seen since 2009 here. Traders on this trading floor telling me that at 1.37, the pound last hit that level against the US dollar in March 2009. You're seeing that anxiety being felt across Asian markets today, when earlier in the day, when results first started trickling in, traders told me that there was a sense of complacency. Most of their clients in Asia had factored in a Remain vote. That has changed dramatically over the last couple of hours as these results have started trickling in. And as one trader here told me, this is the closest decision he's ever seen.
Karishma, do you think this is a panic reaction, which will, as people in favour of our leaving the EU have always said, there'd be a bit of a disturbance, but it would soon sort itself out? Or is there a feeling of this is a serious downturn that's going to sustain itself?
I think there is a degree of panic, and as I was saying earlier, that sense of complacency that the Remain vote would emerge as the stronger vote today. It's still a long way to go till we get those results, as you've been saying all morning on the channel, but certainly a sense of long-term impact is also being felt on trading floors across Asia today. I think there is a sense of anxiety and how this will all play out as the results come through later in the day.
Thank you very much indeed, Karishma. Now we join James Reynolds in Brussels. James, I don't know, you were going to be at a pub, presumably meant to be celebrating Remain. The Funky Monkey, I was told. Is that right, in Brussels? But you're not from the Funky Monkey, obviously. What has been the reaction so far?
We're standing in the cold now.
Oh,
the Funky Monkey gave up hours ago. We're standing in the cold, looking up at the Berlaymont building because, as you can probably notice, some of the lights are on. That is a little bit unusual at past 4 o'clock in the morning, but I doubt that anybody in the building behind me has had any sleep. They will be incredibly nervous about what they're seeing. And if there is a Brexit result, we expect Donald Tusk and Jean-Claude Juncker to come out about late morning and say something. If they have to negotiate with a Britain which is about to leave, they will not want to make it easy. Remember, the European Union, the European Economic Community, was designed, of course, to go one way, to have more integration, to have more passengers, more nations. It wasn't designed to stop and let someone off. And the danger here, among those in this building, they're worried that if Britain goes, more countries with Eurosceptic populations may be tempted to hold votes of their own.
So you don't think that that was just scare tactics to get Britain to stay in the EU? You think it was, they meant it when they said out is out and we'll have no truck with you? Or at least it won't be much fun for you?
Not just them, Francois Hollande said that as well, because all these countries are incredibly worried, not just about Britain, but about all these other countries as well. France, Austria, Italy, Finland, Denmark. They don't want to give too good a deal to Britain for fear that the others might think, oh, that's not a bad idea, let's do the same.
So you're expecting some statement or other in early in the morning, or later in the morning, I should say, because it's 4 o'clock now.
Yeah, we expect Martin Schulz, the President of the European Parliament, to speak first, and then a few hours later we expect Mr Juncker and Mr Tusk to speak as well, perhaps late in the morning.
Are you alarmed about what they might say, Jacob Rees-Mogg?
No, I'm not. I think that there will be an initial period of bullying attempts to try and get us to change our minds. The EU is always very reluctant to accept referendums in any country that goes against their wishes, but that we're their biggest customer.
They normally try and get them reversed by
they
another
do.
one a few months
But
later.
I don't think the British will stand for that. But we are their biggest customer. It's hugely in their interest to trade with us. If we had reciprocal tariffs against the European Union, the damage it would do to the German car industry, to the Irish farming industry, would be enormous. It is not in their interest. And therefore, I think ultimately they will not do it. I'd also add that if the European Union is the sort of club that if you want to leave it, you get kneecapped, it's not a club you want to belong to in the first place. It's a bit like the mafia.
Hilary, do you think that's a sanguine view, or do you think he's optimistic?
Well, the problem with the Leave argument has been, if you walk away, as they've made it clear, from the largest single market in the world, you create a great deal of uncertainty. And uncertainty is not going to be good for the economy or for people's jobs. But we have yet to see what the result is.
So you don't think there'll be necessarily be punitive measures by the EU?
Well, it's very hard to see how they would give us as good, and certainly not a better deal, if we were outside of the European Union than they give themselves remaining in. And it's the uncertainty that is the problem. Because business investment hates one thing above everything else, and that is uncertainty. And if they think they're not sure what our trading relationships were going to be, they'd invest elsewhere. Now, that's why we argued so passionately for Remain, and I still hope we might just dip it, but it's really, really close, of course.
James, are you hearing all that going on here? Do you want to comment on it?
They'll be listening to, and they'll be trying to count the votes themselves as well. If they do get through to Remain, you can imagine the biggest exhale of breath that could possibly move tides. But at the moment, if it goes to Brexit, they'll be tiptoeing out, trying to make sure they don't step upon the smithereens of the European project.
I just wanted to add, there's an excellent report by the House of Lords European Committee setting out what happens if a country leaves under Article 50, and that the whole purpose of Article 50 is to make sure that the departure causes the fewest shocks to the EU economy as well as to the departing country's economy. It's a balanced report written mainly by a pro-European committee, and it just sets out the purpose of Article 50 and how it would operate.
Well, we'll see how that transpires. Emily.
To talk to a couple of young voters in their 20s, Generation 2016. Abby Awajobi, very nice to see you, for the Remain camp, and Darren Grimes from Leave. And Abby, you're representative in a way of London. You're for Remain, and you're County Durham, and you've gone with Brexit. I wonder how engaged you feel your friends and your colleagues and your peers have been on this issue. Do you think you're voting the same way as them? Has there been energy around it?
There's definitely been a lot of energy around this particular issue. I think that, in general, my friends, all the people that I normally associate with from university, they all have, you know, an understanding of politics. But I looked on, you know, my Facebook today, and every single post was about Brexit. People that I went to school with, people I went to university with, and it's something people care about, even if they don't fully understand everything to do with it.
And they've all voted. Do you think that vote has got out? Or?
I wouldn't say they've all voted, but I think they've all engaged in the debate.
Is that the same for you, Darren?
Yes, again, I think some haven't voted, and some feel like this is their opportunity to actually make change. You know, this is their chance to change things for our country.
That whole idea that I can't remember what they called it, call a gran or call your nan or whatever it was. Did you talk to elderly relatives in your family? Did you find there was a difference, or did you find that whole idea horribly patronising?
Yes, I did.
Yeah.
My grandmother, I was raised to respect my elders, not talk down to them.
Yeah.
Insinuate that they are racist or xenophobic, which is what I think that campaign implied.
Right. Because it was all about young people being for Remain and old people being for Brexit.
People ruin your future.
I think that's probably a bit extreme. I mean, there were obviously surveys that were done, and it did show that young people are more in favour of remaining. And I think that that is an issue because at the end of the day, we'll have to live with the consequences of this referendum longer than someone like your gran, which is not to say that old people's opinions don't matter, but just that it might affect us for a longer period of time.
Where did you get your information from for this? I mean, there have been so many TV debates, there's been so much campaigning, there's been so many airwave speeches, but I'm wondering if it was all online for you? Was it Twitter? Was it in the pub? I don't know what...
So I don't study politics, so this was something that I took upon myself. I realised that this was such a monumental referendum. You know, this would change the direction our country goes in. So a lot of it, online, you know, researching and looking into how this would affect me personally and the country as a whole, and on the whole, deciding that it's better for us to vote Leave.
I'm a little bit different to Darren. I studied politics and international relations at Warwick University, and then I did an Erasmus in Berlin on an EU programme. So I studied the European Union in depth at university, so I had a lot of information in terms of theory. But what I found quite interesting was I learned a bit more about what people's feelings about the EU are versus what the facts are. And actually, I think this is going to be a referendum that's won on perception rather than facts.
Right, because there was a lot of talk about the tone of the campaign putting people off, but actually, you could argue that a really vicious, or quite a nasty campaign is something that you can't miss, and the turnout has been pretty high, hasn't it?
Yes, it has, but
I mean, do you think that's a bad thing? Do you think it was a bad campaign? Do you think it was an energising campaign? How do you see it?
I don't think it was a bad campaign. I think any campaign that gives power to individuals, this is decided by the people, for the people, is a really powerful thing. And I think we should all be incredibly proud of our democracy for, serving in action as it has over the past few months.
Did you feel alone for your age group as a Brexiteer, or not at all? Is that a myth?
Certainly an uphill battle, but we've had so many engaged young people realising that this is their once-in-a-generation chance to take back control and look forward to a brighter future.
And you talked about the Erasmus scheme, obviously very much part of what the EU does. If this is Brexit, then that sort of stuff is probably behind us, right?
I think it's a sad day if we do decide to leave the EU. I mean, I've talked about my experience going on Erasmus, but there's a wider debate, which is what kind of country we want to be seen as. Do we want to be seen as the kind of country that shies away from the decision-making, or do we want to be someone that takes part?
We've got to leave it now because I think we're expecting Nigel Farage. David.
Thank you very much. So I think we're joined by Nigel Farage. I hope we are. He's speaking.
Ladies and gentlemen,
supporters. Let's hear him.
Dare to dream that the dawn is breaking on an independent, United Kingdom. If the predictions now are right, this will be a victory for real people, a victory for ordinary people, a victory for decent people. We have fought against the multinationals, we fought against the big merchant banks, we fought against big politics, we fought against lies, corruption and deceit, and today, honesty, decency and belief in nation, I think now is going to win. And we will have done it. We will have done it without having to fight, without a single bullet being fired. We'd have done it by damned hard work on the ground, by people like my friend Mr. Banks here. And by people in the Labour Party and the Conservative Party and UKIP and of no party who've taken part in this campaign. And we'll have done it not just for ourselves, will have done it for the whole of Europe. I hope this victory brings down this failed project and leads us to a Europe of sovereign nation states trading together, being friends together, cooperating together, and let's get rid of the flag, the anthem, Brussels, and all that has gone wrong. Let June the 23rd go down in our history as our Independence Day.
Interesting there. Nigel Farage, in effect, claiming victory for the campaign, even though he wasn't part of the official campaign. We haven't heard from the leaders of that campaign, from Michael Gove, or we haven't heard from Mr. Grayling. It's Nigel Farage actually just sort of taking command of the situation and saying that victory is theirs and all the rest of it. So, we join Justin Greening. What do you make? Did you hear Mr. Farage there, Justin Greening?
I did, yes.
Relishing his moment of glory. Why are things not going so well for your party and for the Remain campaign? I mean, we're making no assumptions about who's won.
Yeah, and obviously this is still way too close to call. It's still comparatively early in the evening in terms of the results coming through. So I think Nigel Farage has really jumped the gun in what he's just said. But in the end, what we do know is this has been a very close-fought campaign and referendum, and it'll have a very close result. And so what we'll need to do is knit our country back together and recognise that whoever wins tonight, whichever side, probably 1 in 2 people watching this programme right now will have voted for the side that didn't come out on top. And it's really important that whatever path our country takes, first of all, that we respect the result of this referendum. This is respect for democracy as well. And I'm certainly committed to making whatever path we take work, but it has to work for the whole of our country. And I think it's way too early in the night to be calling it one way or another. What we do know is that it's incredibly tight, it's incredibly close. A lot of this is going to go down on turnout. And clearly, as we just heard from the 2 fantastic young people who were interviewed earlier on, the engagement of young people in this referendum has been absolutely critical. And we shouldn't forget that in the end, it's their future that we're very much deciding tonight.
I have to say, yes, I think your optimism may be ill-founded, but anyway, we shall see in an hour or so's time. But if your optimism is ill-founded and if it's a vote Leave that wins, what should happen?
Well, again, I think it's way too early to call this referendum result. What I do know is that whatever the result, we have to respect it.
OK, fine, you said
that. And we'll
that.
have to
You've
make
said
the
that.
best
All right.
of it for our country.
OK, let me try you on another one. Why has it got so close?
We had the referendum because this is a heated debate that many people around our country have had for many, many years. There would have been no point having a referendum on a topic where people largely agreed. Everyone knows that this has been a debate that has very much divided public opinion. And it was time to take this debate out of Westminster, away from MPs, and actually give it to people in Britain to decide. And we've had a historic referendum. We will have a historic result that will take our country in one path or another. But I think it was right to give the British people their say.
And did you fight the campaign in the right way, or was it too negative on your part, on the Conservative part, on David Cameron's part? A negative campaign. Things like George Osborne's budget threatening to put our income tax by 2 pence in the pound, to remove pensioners a triple lock on their pensions, all those things. Do you think people just turned away from it because it was trying by fear to force them to vote the way that David Cameron and you wanted them to vote?
I think we did run a positive campaign. At the same time, though, it was important to talk to people about some of the clear risks that Britain faces with the decision of leaving the EU. And I think whoever you are interviewing now, whichever side they've been campaigning on, I think you could ask them the same question and they'd probably say, oh, the other side did Project Fear. So I think it was a hard-fought campaign. There were pros and cons of whatever choice people made, and I think both sides were very keen to obviously point those out. From my perspective, certainly within London, we ran a very positive campaign, and I think that's been responded to very well by lots of young people, and I met lots of people yesterday out campaigning, and and they were voting for the first time. So I think aside from this result, I hope that one of the legacies of this referendum will be a brand new generation of young people who've become electors in the election system that we have here in the UK, and I think will hopefully shout loudly and shout for their view for our country, not just today, but in coming elections.
Thank you very much, Justin Greening. Thanks for joining us at dawn, as dawn breaks over Westminster. Jeremy, shall we just have a look at these key central 40 or so counts that are going to determine or will demonstrate to us which way this is going?
Sure. In general elections, we call them bellwethers, don't we? And we wondered, can we find any bellwethers in this list of 382 counting areas? About 24 hours ago, a friend said to me, is there any one moment that I should stay up for that will tell me what the result is? And I said, well, try Durham. Now, I'm not suggesting that Durham does give you the result, but let's just see why I chose that particular area. So here we have 382 counting areas. They're arranged by Euroscepticism. The deal is this: if it's a 50-50 result, the ones in the middle, we'll call them the middle 40, would go 50-50, so would be evenly split. Once the result goes towards one side or the other, to remain or to leave, the middle 40, by definition, start to shift. So let's have a look in close-up at that middle 40 now and see what it tells us. By the way, take a glance at the map. The pretty random selection of places that we're looking at here, but that's in the nature of this. So here are the middle 40 for you. And just a glance will tell you that there's a bit more blue than yellow at the top of these bars. The colour that is has won the area is at the top of the bars. So blue for leave at the top of more bars than yellow. Now, I mentioned Durham. Why Durham? Well, Durham is in here. Let's just see where it is. I'm just trying to find it. Left-hand in. Oh, this way. OK, right. So now I mentioned Durham because quite a lot of voters in Durham. It's not just the city, it's the county council area. And it's one of these 50-50 areas which, if there is a national swing one way or the other, is going to paint this lot either blue or yellow. And Durham did go blue. But let's be a little bit more scientific. Let's take all of the 40, the middle 40, those 50-50 counting areas, and try and work out what percentage they're returning. We put them all together. Let's have a look here. So we bring on our graph. So the middle 40, those ones that would be 50-50 if the nation were to be evenly split, have come in like this. And isn't this fascinating? 52% leave, 48% to remain. So the ones that we've thought of as the bellwethers here have come in with a 4% lead to leave. So there we are. I mentioned Durham at the start. I don't know whether Durham will be borne out by events that follow.
OK, hold on a second. Let's just get
over
these
to
down.
you.
Thanks very much. John, come on then, mark our card.
Well, I think there you've got another indication of why we've been saying for quite a while now that A, this referendum looks close. 52% is not a big victory for either side. But that secondly, the balance of advantage in the results insofar, we've now got, getting close to 60% of the votes in, it does appear to lie with the Leave side. And that if things carry on as they have been for much longer, then I think the truth is it's going to be difficult to escape the conclusion that Leave have won. But as I say, there's still quite a lot to go. Maybe there's a few tricks up there later in the stage. But at the moment, at least, Leave are undoubtedly the favourites. And Jeremy's bellwethers shows you why.
Thanks, John. Well, I'm joined here by Chuka Umuno, who's Shadow Business Secretary, and Steve Hilton, the former Prime Minister's Director of Strategy, thought to be, I won't say the Prime Minister.
I think the former went in the wrong place.
Yeah, I'm the former.
The former Prime Minister.
Prime Minister.
I'm a former Shadow Business Secretary.
You're a former Business Secretary, Shadow Business Secretary, and you were the Prime Minister's former Director
early in the
of
morning,
Strategy.
David. It's early. It's very early.
It's very early in the morning, and we're at our best early in the morning. Steve Hilton, where do you stand now? Because you had an extraordinary role in this campaign. Two things you said. One is you said, if the Prime Minister were a Cabinet Minister, not Prime Minister, I know he'd have been for Leave anyway. That's his whole instinct. And the second thing you said, when they started producing government statistics showing how they'd have to change taxation, how the damage would be done, oh, these statistics, they're all made up, I know, because I used to do that stuff. Is that true? Did you mean that? Total fiction.
I don't mean literally.
Well, you said it literally.
I was referring, I think, to the way in which campaigns, including those that I used to be involved in, exaggerate in order to make their point. And a specific thing that they do, which we saw in this campaign, is take a general argument, for example, you will be worse off, and in order to make that point tangible, try and put a number on it to specify, because that is just a more memorable way of putting it. That's how we ended up with the claim that you'd be exactly £4,300 worse off. Now, there's all sorts of bits of data that you can put into such a calculation, but truly, everyone involved knows that that is not literally true. They don't really mean
£4,300,
right.
but do they mean people will be worse off?
They believe that they'll be worse off.
And do you believe they'll be worse off?
I don't, but I'm on the other side of the argument.
Well, no, you're not entirely on the other side of the argument, because people have talked about... I mean, Michael Gove talked about bumps along the road. People have talked about temporary upsets and all that. You don't believe that will happen?
I don't know, and I think that's the fundamental point here, which is that none of us really knows, because the future is, in the end, unpredictable. And the argument I was making all along is that the question today was, what are the circumstances for running a country that give you the best chance of helping people avoid bumps in the road, helping people to raise their living standards when we don't know what the future brings? The world changes very quickly. And my argument was, if we actually control the levers of economic power, it's more likely that we avoid those problems.
And the litany of experts, which was so much reviled by Michael Gove, among others, the Bank of England, Mr. Carney, the IFS, the Treasury, all those. You concur with all that all these experts are just blathering away to know...
Well,
I mean, are they not doing proper sums? Are they not... What do they spend their days doing?
I believe that they believe it.
They believe it.
But, you know, in the end, that's just one view. People...
They could get rid of them all.
No, they do very important jobs. But I think that people listening to that actually understood that this was not about that. This referendum was much more fundamental about how we run our country, how we govern our country. And I think that was what really happened in this campaign, that it shifted from some of those very specific things into a deeper argument about the best way to give people a sense of control over the things that matter to them. And I think what's happened is people have expressed real anger at a sense of being ignored by the system, a sense that they aren't listened to, and that almost whoever they vote for, nothing really changes. And and that, I think, was at the heart of all this.
Chuka Umunna, former Shadow Business Secretary. What do you make of this? Do you think all those experts were wrong? Do you think the campaign was fought on a false prospectus?
No, I don't think so. And I think one of the important qualifications to make to Steve's remarks are the fragmented nature of the result. It's not going to be an overwhelming victory for whichever side wins. Look, I thought at the beginning of this campaign that it was going to be a very close result. You have to say, I agree with John, that looking at the results that have come in so far, it is not looking promising for Remain. Whatever the result is, we have to respect it, we have to listen, and we have to learn the lessons. But in
you have to leave the EU.
Well, that may be what is about to happen, but let's not forget.
Well, it will happen, won't it, if that is the result?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. If that happens, that will be what
even by one vote?
Even by one vote. But you've had geographical variations in how people are voting. You've got differentiations according to social class. There's definitely a generational difference here. There may be a gender difference as well. So you've got quite a fragmented society in some senses there. And that isn't just an issue for the Labour Party, that is an issue for every party. And that's why when Nigel Farage, and maybe he is being premature here, but when he gets up and when he says this is a victory for decent, honest, real, ordinary people, that tends to suggest that all the people who've just voted for us to stay don't fit into that category. Now, the challenge for us as policymakers, as politicians, is how do we knit together our society after this division? Now, I mean, there are particular issues here for the Labour Party, which I'm very happy to go into, but that for me...
Go on, then. What are the issues for the Labour Party?
Well, I think for the Labour Party, there's no doubt that for part of the coalition that gets a Labour government elected, in particular, immigration trumped everything else in this debate. I don't actually think for a lot of our supporters and voters, sovereignty was quite the overwhelming issue that immigration became. And why did it become such an overwhelming issue, in spite of all the warnings of the experts that you talk about, David? Is because a lot of people felt, well, you're saying all this about the economy, but I don't actually feel I'm getting a hell of a lot from that economy at the moment. Now, many people in the Labour Party, the overwhelming majority of the Parliamentary Labour Party, by the way, are well, alive to this. And the reason that we as a party argued for us to stay in the European Union is that we didn't think the way that you deal with the issues that migration poses and all the other challenges we have, we didn't think the way you deal with that is by crashing the economy. I mean, look what has happened to the pound sterling. $1.35 to the pound, the lowest rate since 1985. Another observation is also, I mean, it would be quite interesting to see what happens to UKIP following what people think may be the result now, because what you've kind of seen, if you like, is a takeover of the Conservative Party by UKIP. I mean, you have these big figures, Boris Johnson, Michael Gove, Ian Duncan-Smith and others, who've basically been parroting many of the same lines that Nigel Farage has been running for the last few years.
But what about Jeremy Corbyn? What about the Labour Party? Why did it fail to galvanise people to vote Remain, which is what Labour Party's half-hearted policy was?
I think three things. First of all, the economy argument didn't work when there are people who don't feel they have enough of a stake in the economy.
Why use it?
Well, you're asking why. I'm just
Yes.
giving you the.
I mean, could Labour have done better? Is what I'm saying.
Secondly,
Could Labour have done better?
Yes, we could have done better, and we need a more credible policy, a Labour, that's true to our Labour values on immigration. And we've struggled with this. We got to a OK position going into the general election, but it didn't convince the public. And in many respects, it was an accountant's answer to a problem that isn't just economic and in the perception of our supporters, but is also a cultural issue too. And people were not clear enough about what the Labour Party's position was. We had polling evidence 2.5 to 3 weeks ago where many of our voters did not know what Labour's position was. And it'd be completely disingenuous for me to sit here and say that was not an issue and that may have compromised the Remain vote.
All right, we'll come back here a moment. Let's just go to Emily and we'll come back down later on. Emily.
I'm going to talk to Will Straw, who's the campaign chief for Britain Stronger in Europe. Will Straw, we heard what sounded rather like a victory speech from Nigel Farage a few moments ago. Do you concede defeat in your camp?
Well, there's still, as I think John Curtis said, about 40% of results still to go. So we need to wait and see what the outcome of all of those are. But whatever the result this evening, it's clear that it's going to be very close. And it's also clear, I think, that we are in a very divided country. Effectively, as the results we've been seeing this evening, big victories for Remain in London, parts of Scotland, some other big cities, and then big wins for Leave in many parts of England and Wales. So I think there is a real need, whatever the result, for both sides to accept it and to think about how we can come together as a country in what will, I think, be challenging times, whatever happens.
Yeah, I mean, Wales as a whole went Leave, and it sounds as if Birmingham is going Leave. Would you say that the campaign has gone badly wrong?
Well, let's wait and see what the result is. I'm proud of the campaign we ran. Today, right around the country, we had thousands of volunteers passionately believing in the case for remaining in the European Union, making that case in their communities and trying to persuade people to get to the polls.
So what
let's
didn't
see
work
what
then?
happens.
I mean, from what we know so far then, clearly, if Wales has gone for Leave, you've lost a whole country in the UK. What didn't work for your campaign? Was there too much David Cameron, too much George Osborne? Do you wish you'd done it differently as Labour?
Well, let's wait and see what the final result is. But given how narrow it is, I think this is definitely a wake-up call for political and economic elites. The arguments that have been made about the benefits of being in the European Union and the risks of leaving clearly haven't worked as well as we would have liked. Otherwise, we would be several points ahead. But I think we will find out in the days and weeks ahead, if indeed we have voted to leave, whether those warnings were true or not.
It's
But I
funny,
think
though,
it's
isn't it, to talk
important
of
now
a wake-up call at this point? You've already seen UKIP doing well from 2013 onwards. Why is Labour still talking about a wake-up call 3 years after your voters have already told you what they feel on so many of these issues like immigration?
Well, I think the truth is that in different parts of the country, people have different issues that they care about. And what we tried to do in this campaign was to set out the benefits for people, economically, for Britain's place in the world, from remaining in the European Union and the risks that they would be lost. We tried to confront the Leave campaign on what we thought were the misinformation that they were spreading on immigration in particular. I thought that was done very well at the BBC debate at Wembley earlier this week. But as I say, I mean, it's still very close. There is still more results to come. But the country is divided, and this is a very, very close result. So there's clearly going to be a lot of reflection that I think all sides of politics will have to do when the dust has settled tomorrow.
If it does come down to a percentage point or so, do you see any possibility of a second referendum? Is that something that you would push for, or would you accept a result for Leave?
No, I think whatever the result, we have to accept that. This has been a democratic process. There's clearly been very high turnout across the country, and it's important that the decision is respected. But of course, in a referendum like this, the consequences of people's decisions are also theirs, and we will see in the days and weeks ahead, depending on what the outcome is, whether those warnings from economic experts do come to pass. And I think it is striking that already the pound has plummeted to $1.35. I think Chukramuna was saying the lowest it's been since, or the fastest drop since the 1980s. So there's clearly going to be a huge amount to unpack. But as I say, I mean, there are still a number of results still to come in.
Just briefly, because Chukramuna said you have to be true to our Labour values on immigration, and many of your supporters would not know what that means. What are true Labour values on immigration?
Well, what we've tried to do in this campaign when talking about immigration is to recognise this is a big issue for people up and down the country. That, I think, is very clear, but that there are also a lot of positives that we get from having people come to this country from the EU and elsewhere, the benefits that it brings to the National Health Service. And indeed, if we do decide to leave the EU, that there will be consequences for Brits, and we'll find out if indeed we have voted to leave, what those consequences might be. So that's the argument that we've been making. It's now for the political parties to think about whether there are different policies they want to propose on immigration. But I think, again, if we have voted to leave, what we will spend our time doing over the next several years is working out how we unpick our relationship with the EU. This is not going to be something that happens overnight. We know that there is this Article 50 process that would have to be triggered. Then we would need to negotiate our trading relationships with other countries around the world. So I think the main preoccupation is going to be trying to work out if there has been a Leave vote this evening, why that was the eventuality that took place, and then really understanding what is going to happen to our position in the world and our economy over the not just days but years ahead.
Will Straw, thank you very much.
So Martin Oates joins us from Poole in the West Country, Dorset. Martin, what's the position in the southwest? Has that been a disappointment to the Remain campaign, or is that pretty much along the lines they were expecting?
Pretty much as expected, and if you look at Exeter, which was expected to vote Remain, they've done slightly better than they expected. Exeter is by no means typical of the southwest. In many ways, it remains a monument to New Labour. Ben Bradshaw's seat, he trebled his majority at the last election. Labour did very well at the last
and Bristol and Bath are there, of course, too, aren't they?
Yes, indeed, and those were expected to be Remain strongholds. The South Hams was actually the bellwether, Sarah Wollaston's seat, the bellwether seat we were hearing from Jeremy about earlier on. Remain did slightly better than expected, and of course an interesting background there with Sarah Wollaston having declared for Brexit initially, to the surprise of some of her colleagues, although if you looked at her Twitter feed since she'd been elected, you'd have seen lots of evidence for that, and then her sudden change of heart just before the
the whole of the South Hams was influenced by Sarah Wollaston? I rather doubt that.
No, I'm not saying that at all. There's a very interesting demographic there because you've got the enormous fishing port of Brixham, which I think you probably know well, and then the town of Totnes itself, which is the main urban centre, which has got a different profile, affluent, educated. We've been hearing about these potential differences in demographics, so an interesting seat.
And what else have we got to come from the southwest? Are we there now? Is it home and dry? Have we had everything in?
We're waiting for Cornwall, which will be an interesting one. There's been a lot of interest in Cornwall nationally throughout this campaign because Cornwall's received hundreds of millions of pounds of European aid. In fact, there's nowhere in England, there's a bit of Wales which has received that level of funding. There's always been this sense, though, that nonetheless Cornwall's very, very Eurosceptic. We should know very shortly whether that's true or not.
I mean, mainly because of fishing. Give us back our fish.
Fishing, I mean, clearly it's a very emotive issue, but on the other hand, if we look at the rest of the profile of the southwest, I mean, Cornwall's got a strong sense of independence, as I think most people know, but on the other hand, in many ways, in terms of its Euroscepticism, the senses it shares that with the rest of the region. So given what we've seen through the rest of the southwest, it probably won't be that surprising if it's finally confirmed, but it will mean that people like me can finally answer this question definitively, because there's always been this sense that it's very Eurosceptic. There's never really been any solid proof for that.
Martin, thank you very much indeed. The turnout in the United Kingdom as a whole is 72%, which is the highest turnout in a nationwide ballot since 1992. So 1992, 72%. So it's not kind of wildly above what we get in general elections.
No.
Some places it's up to 80, but
Indeed, which is exceptional. Some places it's very, very high, but it is higher than where people expected. A few months ago, there was even a concern in Westminster about how much this would actually catch light at all. If you look back, say, to the AV referendum, where turnout was sort of the same as a local election, people were saying, gosh, I really hope that it gets to something like a general, because what we want is the result to feel like it is valid for whichever side to have a mandate. I think nobody is going to be able to cry foul with a level of turnout such as it is. And I think, given how divided the country appears to be, the fact that there is high turnout has got really to be a good thing. People will have to accept this and they'll have to move on.
Patrick Burns, you're looking rather lonely there in Birmingham now. What's happened? Everybody's abandoned you.
Well, all the drama is down in front of the stage, David, because clearly the result here in Birmingham is imminent, and it has all the makings of an absolute knife edge. One moment, Vote Leave supporters are preparing to raise their placards. I hear now that the Remainers maybe haven't given up the ghost, but the significant thing about this is this is exactly the sort of place that the Remain campaign have been pinning their hopes on, that the second part of the night's going to be better than the first part has been. This single biggest local area count anywhere in mainland Britain, 700,000 voters in the city of Birmingham. And the very fact that this is such a close-run thing speaks volumes, because at the beginning of the evening there was a sort of general expectation that there would be a very comfortable victory for the Remain campaign. I was talking to a Labour MEP who was very sort of jaunty and optimistic about it, and then a little bit later on she, without me even asking, told me that her earlier optimism had evaporated. Another local MP said that whatever the outcome of this in the end, it's exposed the tensions between one region and another, the tensions within the United Kingdom, and there's going to be a sense of real resentment, come what may, either way, given the outcome. Clearly this result in Birmingham is coming up any moment now. One thing I can absolutely assure you, it's going to be very, very close, David.
Thank you. Well, we'll come back to you as soon as it comes through. Patrick Burns saying this feeling of resentment on one side or the other. Do you think that's true? I think that
well, I think it's true. I think it's really important we try and avoid it in that sense. I was a little disappointed, probably more than a little, with what we heard from Nigel Farage earlier, because it felt to me not just that the timing of that was wrong, because I think it is too early to be so clear about things, but much more importantly, the tone of it.
But what, are you surprised?
Well, hang on a second. I just think that I'm very excited by what's happened. This is a great move forward, I think, for the country, and will have a really big impact around the world as well, in a positive direction, in terms of people feeling that they can assert their sovereignty. But it's also a really serious moment. It's not a time, I think, for shouting. and jumping up and down in that way. I think it's really important that we recognise this is a really big decision, something really momentous.
Yes.
Looks like it might be about to happen.
Do you think your friend, or perhaps I should say former friend, David Cameron, can remain Prime Minister and carry through the consequences of this vote? And
Definitely.
go back to Europe
Yeah.
and negotiate on behalf of a...
I really do. I'm not just saying that because I
It's
want
a
him to-
humiliation for him.
Look, I think that he's someone who takes very seriously his duty as Prime Minister to be a steward of the nation's affairs. This is going to be a really big moment where I think this is exactly the kind of thing where he will want to make sure that the country is in safe hands. And I think that he himself, although he's lost this argument, it looks like, although, again, it's a little early to be certain of that, he was saying not that long ago that we can prosper and flourish outside the EU. I think that he is the best person to lead us in what will be a very, very
But he won't,
difficult
he
process.
won't know which direction to go in, will he? Because his whole argument has been about the necessity of staying in the EU. Can't then suddenly start arguing about the necessity of leaving the EU.
Well, I mean,
you're right.
But
it's
that
a very
argument is
ill-
over, frankly, because we had the vote today. So it's no longer about whether, it will be about how. And I think that he will be able to, he's the one who's in the best position to do that well.
But by the very least, Steve Hilton, surely his time in office, the timetable will be shortened and curtailed. Certainly, ministers, MPs are split on whether or not he'd have to go immediately. But what everybody agrees on privately is that his timetable is shortened, no?
I don't really understand why that needs to be the case. He was elected last year for a full term, and that, knowing that there'd be this referendum, there were no conditions attached to that. He should serve the full term.
We have to pause because it's time for an update of the news. So let's join Rita Chakrabarti.
Thank you, David. Well, with more than half the votes counted in the UK's referendum on the EU, it's looking increasingly possible that the Leave camp has built up a clear lead. The overall result is still too close to call, but Leave has better than expected results in vast areas of the country. Remain has had good results in London, Scotland and Northern Ireland. Here's our political correspondent, El Nagania, and her report contains some flash photography.
Moments after polls closed and in Sunderland, the traditional race to be the first to complete their count. And it wasn't long before Leave marked a huge win here with 61%.
Ladies and gentlemen.
Across the northeast, results soon showed Leave doing consistently better than predicted. A big win in Hartlepool and pushing Remain into a narrow victory in Newcastle.
65,404.
A much smaller win than expected.
Votes cast in favour of Leave.
Away from the north of England, in Basildon in Essex, another big win for Leave. And another count with a big turnout at 74%. And in Flintshire, just as across much of Wales, voters are backing Brexit. But in Edinburgh, the Remain campaign secured a big win. And there was good news for Remain in the London borough of Lambeth, with 79%, a much better result than expected. By 2 a.m, the result was still looking very tight indeed.
I think it's going to be extremely close. And there is a disaffected vote, and it's disaffected with politics overall, disaffected with Westminster politics in particular. Some of that is our Labour supporters too, and we've done our best to try and turn that round, but it's been tough.
But as more results came in, the UKIP leader started to smell victory.
This, if the predictions now are right, this will be a victory for real people, a victory for ordinary people, a victory for decent people.
It's becoming increasingly clear there is a north-south split in England, with Remain doing better than expected in London, fulfilling expectations across the south east and west, but doing far worse in the north and across the Midlands. Ellen Nagania, BBC News.
Well, early results have upset the world's financial markets, with the pound falling again in the past hour to $1.34, its lowest point since 1985. Polls closed, it soared to $1.50, but as they showed stronger than expected support for leaving the EU, it began to plummet. Markets in Asia are down nearly 3%. The Italian Coast Guard says it rescued around 4,500 migrants in the Mediterranean yesterday. Good weather and calm seas have led to more people risking the journey from North Africa. The charity MSF has been helping the rescue operation. A woman's body was recovered from one of the vessels near the Libyan coast. Rescue workers in the eastern Chinese city of Yancheng are searching for survivors of a tornado and heavy hailstorm. The state broadcaster says 98 people have been killed and more than 800 injured. A man has been jailed for life for plotting a beheading on the streets of London, inspired by so-called Islamic State, which could have targeted a poppy seller. 23-year-old Nadir Saeed was arrested in November 2014, just days before Remembrance Sunday. One of the world's longest-running civil wars in Colombia has been brought to an end after more than 50 years of fighting. The so-called FARC rebels have signed a deal to lay down their arms following 3 years of negotiations. Well, that's it. There's more from me in a little while.
Well, at 20 minutes to 5, we can now say the decision taken in 1975 by this country to join the common market has been reversed by this referendum to leave the EU. We are absolutely clear now that there is no way that the Remain side can win. It looks as though the gap's going to be something like 52 to 48, so a 4-point lead for leaving the EU. And that's the result of this referendum, which has been preceded by weeks and months of argument and dispute and all the rest of it. The British people have spoken, and the answer is, we're out. Laura.
Well, so rare that a country, as individuals, we get the chance to take a decision as big as this. This was the most profound question we had been asked for decades as a nation of voters. And we have answered it with a vote against the status quo, against political expectation, against the traditional political rules that in Britain voters tend to go with what they're told is their economic self-interest. Instead, people have decided to defy those conventions, defy the expectations of Westminster, defy all the advice from experts, big business, economists and the like, and vote to leave the European Union. And this is a vote that has huge consequences, not just for our country, but also implications for a whole continent. And it unleashes a period of huge uncertainty, maybe huge opportunity, but also maybe huge risks too.
And the immediate results, Kamal Ahmed has been following. What are the financial markets saying?
Well, David, I think this has come as a shock to the financial markets. We were seeing the pound at 10 o'clock last night at record levels for 2016. It has now hit lows not seen since 1985. That is how much the markets are concerned about this decision for Britain to leave the European Union.
Pound is what now to the dollar?
It's down at 134, 135.
How did it begin the evening?
And it started at $1.50, so it's lost 15 cents today. It's fallen over 10%.
What
in
about
currency
stock
terms,
market
David,
figures? Is there anything there?
Well, in currency terms, David, that is astonishing. That type of volatility is higher than in the financial crisis of 2008, when Britain crashed out of the European exchange rate mechanism in 1992. On the stock markets, the Nikkei in Japan, obviously the Asian markets are open at the moment. The Nikkei in Japan is down 3%. This is really a global issue. It just adds to this notion of global uncertainty around. And also that the euro has weakened significantly against the dollar. So clearly, not only is this a UK issue, but this is a euro area issue as well. Because what will the ramifications be when Britain leaves? What will that mean for the other European Union economies, the possibilities of other referendums? But just as Laura says, Britain has made a decision that has sort of reversed that old famous phrase by the Clinton aide, it's the economy stupid when it comes to issues of elections. People have said they don't care what they've been told about the economy, what the reaction may or may not be.
You may just have a different view on the economy from the experts.
Or they may have a different view. And
like
I think,
Steve
frankly,
Hilton,
as well,
they may believe it's going to be better.
Well, I think as well, David, I think a big point which I think has been underestimated by what might be described as the establishment. In 2008, nobody predicted, or very few people predicted, that people might not be able to go to their ATM and get out their own cash out of a bank. I think that really produced a complete disconnect between the public and the people so-called in charge. And I think that is still running now, because if economists tell you A, B and C is going to happen, but in 2008 they couldn't guarantee you could get money out of your bank, well, why listen to them?
Do you think there'll be emergency measures taken by the Chancellor or by the Bank of England this morning to stop a run on sterling, for instance? Are there measures they should or could take?
I am sure that the Bank of England will be considering now what statements they need to make to the markets before the markets open in London in the next 3 hours. And
will the markets open in London, or can the stock market be closed?
They will do. They will do. I mean, we will see the FTSE's futures, which is an index which predicts which way the FTSE is going to go when it opens, is down 8% at the moment. It would be, although we are in uncharted territory, it would be remarkable if the London market did not open. You can, of course, suspend trading if the volatility is so high and the initial fall is so deep. That decision can be taken, and it will be for the Treasury and the Bank of England to come together to talk about that. I'm sure, though, that Mark Carney, the Governor of the Bank of England, and I'm told that he is planning, this is being planned at the moment, will come out with some form of public statement. They hope to do it after the Prime Minister has spoken, to give some form of reassurance about liquidity, about financial support for banks in particular. Banking stocks are likely to be heavily hit when the markets open in London. HSBC, which is one of our biggest banks, is also listed on the Asian markets, and its share price is already falling. Why does this really matter to people? It's quite interesting. I'm getting quite a lot of tweets from businesses saying, I buy in dollars from, from suppliers from abroad, and therefore my costs are going to go up hugely because of this. So on one side, it will be bad for some businesses, but of course, if sterling falls markedly, that is very good for British exports. We've always struggled in the export market. So although economically there are pluses and minuses to what is happening, in terms of the currency, they clearly were far too complacent at 10 o'clock last night about which way this vote was going to go, and they are now desperately trying to change their position on sterling, because sterling, I'm sure, is going to have a pretty torrid time on the markets all day
and with
today.
some holidays coming along, it's not much fun for people planning to go abroad on holiday. They're going to find their pound doesn't go very far.
Those people who were queuing outside currency exchanges yesterday to buy their euros were pretty smart.
John Curtis.
Well, I think you're expressing a degree of surprise about the fact that a majority of people voted to leave, even though they were given the warnings about the economic consequences. Well, I think one thing one needs to realise is that it was only ever the case that a plurality of people, not a majority of people, a plurality of people felt that the economy would suffer as a result of leaving, and that many of the people who were saying they were going to vote for leave were just saying, look, it's not going to make much difference. Conversely, however, on the other crucial issue of this referendum, a majority of people felt that A, immigration is currently too high, and B, that leaving the European Union would result in it falling. And therefore, at the end of the day, although I think some people voted to remain despite their concerns about immigration, the immigration pool was potentially always rather greater than the economy pool. I think the other thing I would say about the financial markets, I've taken the view for quite some time that the financial markets were seriously underestimating the probability of a leave vote. The truth is, if you followed the internet polls throughout this referendum campaign, they never, ever had Remain ahead. They called it a 50-50 shot all the way through. It's also true that actually in the last 2 or 3 weeks of the referendum, the vote for Remain was clearly weakened. And in fact, once you take out some of the methodological changes that the pollsters made along the way, it's very clear, and it was clear before we opened a single ballot box, that the Leave side had actually won the campaign. There'd been a clear shift towards Leave in the public opinion polls during the course of the last 3 or 4 weeks. So you put all that together, I frankly did not understand why the pound was so calm during the course of yesterday.
Thanks, John. James Reynolds joins us from Brussels. Now, I don't know whether anybody's around, whether you've had any chance to talk to anybody, James, but we'd like to know if you have.
They're all hunkering down at the moment, David. It's almost like a giant Brexit-coloured
wrecking ball is about to swath its way through the Berlaymont building. So I would imagine that Eurocrats at the moment are getting ready for the day of their lives. Carl Bildt, one of the most outspoken, high-profile European diplomats, has been almost one of the only ones speaking in the last hour or so. He said that Europe now faces immediate turmoil and possible long-term uncertainty. We expect possibly the President of the European Parliament, Martin Schulz, to come out in the next few hours, and then we expect the other presidents, Donald Tusk and Jean-Claude Juncker, to speak as well. In effect now, it's over to David Cameron, because the European Council will await Mr. Cameron's informing them that he is triggering Article 50 of the European Union Treaty, which calls for 2 years of negotiations for Britain to leave.
Thanks very much indeed. Steve Hilton, let's come back to you and Chuka Umunna and talk a bit about immigration, which John said was one of the key factors in this. Chuka, you start on this. What do you think that Labour's view on immigration, now that you will be free, of course, outside the EU, what should the policy on immigration be? How would you change it?
Well, the first observation to make is I think those who have argued for us to leave the European Union have a huge expectation to meet. Because what they have said is if we leave the European Union, you get back control, as it were, and you can bring immigration down to the tens of thousands. Now, personally, I don't think they're going to be able to deliver on that. If you just take non-EU immigration, it's running at 188,000 net at the moment. That's before you consider current immigration from the EU. And of course, the Vote Leave campaign's policy is to keep the current European citizens living here. So I don't see how they're going to be able to deliver on that. In fact, I don't see how they're going to be able to deliver on a lot of the things, because they've also, people have also been told if we leave the European Union, that's going to lead to huge increases in public service investment. I don't see how that is going to happen, given the track record of many of the people who are saying this, is to cut our services. Now, our investment in our services. In terms of immigration, look, I think we need a much better debate about this. On the one hand, there is this kind of suggestion that just get rid of the EU immigrants and all of our problems will be solved. And clearly, as I've just said, I don't think that is going to happen. On the other end, you have people who say, look, immigration overwhelmingly has been a good thing for society. Just look at the economic data. I don't agree with that either. I think we have got to look at the way free movement operates within the EU. Now, maybe we're not going to have to look at that anymore. In fact, we definitely won't have to look at that anymore in that sense, because we're not going to be in the European Union, so it would seem. But we need to look at the way migration flows work. And I think we also need to look not only at the economic impact of immigration, we need to be clear that there are benefits that come with it as well. But it's not just an economic thing. We've got to work out how we better integrate people into our society. We're obsessed with the numbers, and it's right that we should look at the numbers coming in. But actually, although we're very diverse communities, we're not terribly integrated. Can I just say a couple of final things? This moment, this is a seismic moment for our country that goes far beyond all the personalities. There's going to be a lot of chat what happens to David Cameron. This is a big thing for our country. And what this has exposed is a lot of division, and there's a lot of talk as if this is an overwhelming win. It isn't. There's 48% of people on the current projection who did not vote for this. Now, the challenge for people in this context is how to lead and bring our country together. Because we can take one of two courses. You can go the Donald Trump avenue, which is to go into the blame thing and look at who we blame for our problems, or you adopt a different approach, which is how do we bring a splintered and fragmented society together to meet these big, complex challenges. Now, my view is that is the way forward, is how do you unify and bring our country together? And I tell you, this is a big wake-up call to the European Union itself, because this is going to have a profound effect on the French presidential election next year, in the election in Italy, the year after that. They need to see this as a wake-up call as well. This isn't just an issue for us here in the UK, it's an issue for Europe, the European Union as a whole. All right, I'll come back to you, Steve Hilton. We're just joined by Keith Vaz, who's the chairman of the Home Affairs Select Committee, who joins us from Kettering. Mr. Vaz, what do you think is going to happen now?
Well, David, good morning. This is a crushing decision. It's a terrible day for Britain and a terrible day for Europe, with immense consequences. 41 years when British ministers went over and embedded themselves in trying to make sure that Europe was open protecting the single market. This is all gone in this day, and it's just so terrible. I think what needs to happen now, of course, is there has to be an emergency summit. I would be surprised if next week the EU leaders did not meet together, because we are one of the biggest countries in the EU. We are crucial to the success of the EU, and therefore the leaders have got to get together, and David Cameron has got to be there, and there has got to be a workable plan to ensure that we implement the wishes of the British people. Even though we think it's the wrong decision, we have to respect that decision. It will have huge implications for our security, in particular the migration crisis, dealing with illegal migration. We need the support of our EU partners to deal with the situation in Calais. It will have huge implications for our counter-terrorism strategy, the issues surrounding the European arrest warrant. All these matters are now put at risk by the decision that has been taken. Frankly, David, in 1,000 years, I would never have believed that the British people would have voted in this way, and they have done so. And I think that they voted emotionally rather than looking at the facts, and it'll be catastrophic for our country, for the rest of Europe, and indeed the world.
Why do you think they voted this way?
Well, I think you've correctly identified the issues of immigration are extremely important. If you look at the campaign, I think that there needed to be a much stronger campaign to stay in. The Leave campaigners were prepared to indulge in hand-to-hand combat in local constituencies. I'm very pleased to say that the Leicester result has come in, and Leicester has voted to remain, but with a very, very small majority, only 2,500. This is a big shock to all of us in Leicester. If a city like Leicester just manages to vote Remain, then there is a real problem in the way in which we put across the arguments and explained what we plan to do in reforming the European Union. The country obviously accepts that the European Union, in the Prime Minister's words, was not perfect, and they've decided it isn't perfect and they want to come out. So we have to accept that. But I think that the way we put these arguments across was perhaps not as effective as the way the Leave campaign was prepared to go into local constituencies, appeal to the emotions of local people, and act in that way. And that is what they did. They rejected the advice of all the experts. They rejected the arguments that had been put forward by almost everyone in Parliament. I mean, those who are going to vote against this were in the minority, and the country has accepted it. They've rejected everything that's been put before this.
It's
before
democracy.
Them,
it's
very,
democracy,
very
isn't it?
and
It's
very crushing.
It's democracy.
It is. Absolutely, it is democracy, and that's why I'm saying that we have to respect this decision, but we have to act in the best interests of our country. And I think that David Cameron really fought a very strong campaign. He went round the country and he put the arguments to the British people, but they have rejected those arguments.
All right.
And therefore, what we now need to do is to work with colleagues to make sure that we get the best deal in respect of our exit.
Keith Vowes, thank you very
Words
much.
I never thought I would ever say.
Thank you for joining us. Fiona Hislop joins us now from Falkirk of the Scottish National Party Culture and External Affairs Secretary, and has responsibility for Europe. Now, all along, the concern has been by Unionists that if England voted Brexit and Scotland voted Remain, it would be an argument for another referendum and Scotland would leave the Union and remain in the EU. Is that what you now think is a prospect? Is that what should happen?
Well, Scotland's clearly and decisively voted to remain part of the European Union, 62% to 38%, an increased turnout even from the Scottish Parliament elections barely 6 weeks ago. Now, that clearly sends a strong message. It's quite clear that we see a different type of politics in Scotland, a different approach to constitutional affairs, and I think people will be looking very closely at this result and looking at the prospects for Scotland and what was in the best interest interests of Scotland going forward. We set out in our manifesto barely 6 weeks ago our conditions and our concerns about when and if an independence referendum would take place. But the reaction from people, many of whom will have voted no to Scottish independence less than 2 years ago, on the premise, quite falsely from David Cameron, that somehow we wouldn't be part of the European membership, should be looking very closely and reappraising their situation just now. So I think the reaction from Scotland will be strong. It's been strong tonight, but we'll see it in the next few days as we obviously see the final result playing out.
So you certainly wouldn't... Well, the final result, I think, is fairly clear. There seems to be something like a 4-point or so between them. But Nicola Sturgeon says that when it becomes clear, let's just see her quotation, her remarks, while the overall result remains to be declared, well, we're nearly there, the vote makes clear that the people of Scotland see their future as part of the European Union. The process for that, what would that be?
Well, we clearly have interests in our European Union membership, and clearly we want to make sure that our trading and our connections with our European neighbours and partners can continue. The basis of that will have to be negotiated, whatever the result finally as it comes through. But we're quite clear. The Scottish Government will protect Scotland's interests, whatever the circumstances, and we intend to do that. Now, how we do that will depend on exactly what the result is. But we're very, very clear. The Scottish people have spoken. Their interests are about maintaining that membership. They are interested in maintaining our relations with Europe. We have to find the means by which we can do that. But clearly, there's some way to go in terms of determining the mechanism of doing that. But, you know, decisions have consequences. And if the United Kingdom has made a decision against the interests of the Scottish people, that will have consequences.
Fiona Hislop, thank you very much. Laura, you're off to Downing Street,
I
gather. What are you going to do in Downing Street?
Well, we're going to wait and see what the Prime Minister is going to come out and say, because this is
What,
such
at 5
an
in the
enormous
morning,
moment.
you think he'll be
well,
out?
we've predicted there's going to be a dawn raid. It was being called and predicted as his dawn raid statement. Now, we are not necessarily expecting anything very imminent, but we're out at Elstree, so it might take me a while to get there. And we certainly don't want to miss it. This is such a huge moment for our politics. This is certainly the biggest political decision we've taken in my lifetime, probably the biggest political decision we will take in my whole lifetime. This has implications for absolutely everything, for our economy, for immigration policy, for our place in the world, for good or for ill. This decision will define our politics for years to come. But of course, one of the most pressing immediate issues is what it means for David Cameron's time in office. There's a tension there between whether or not this huge defeat, a huge snub for his personal authority, drives him out of office, or whether or not he feels that pull that Steve Hilton was suggesting, that at a tumultuous time, it's his responsibility to fight to stay on, to try to give an impression of calm, at least, while this decision sinks in around the world and around the country.
Well, you be off to Downing Street, and we'll hear from you
talk
there.
very shortly from there, depending
Yes.
how quickly I can get there.
OK. Thank you very much
Pleasure.
indeed, Laura.
Talk to you soon.
Kamal, just pick us up on the latest moves on markets and money and all the rest.
Yeah, so the Nikkei, that's the Japanese stock market, has fallen sharply. It's down about 8%. We've seen the pound as being down now, flirting with levels not seen since 1985. As I said before, David, what's called FTSE Futures, so that's an index that predicts where the FTSE 100 in London will go once it opens in 3 hours' time. That's down 7%. I mean, just touches on this point, as Laura was saying, this is a global issue. The euro itself has fallen towards parity with the dollar, so the euro currency is also being sold. There's a real flight to safety, I think it's called. So people are moving towards the dollar. Gold has gone up by 7% today. I just think that the uncertainty that this creates will create this very volatile day on the markets and will mean that for the next 24 hours, certainly, and certainly for the next few days, as the markets try and digest something that, frankly, they didn't believe was going to happen, will be astonishingly volatile. And I'm sure that, well, of course, George Osborne, whilst he remains as Chancellor, Mark Carney, the Governor of the Bank of England, will be in discussion about how they can provide at least a degree of reassurance that volatility doesn't spiral into anything worse within the UK economy.
OK. Steve Hilton, you heard Keith Vaz from the Home Affairs Committee really moved,
Yeah.
speaking as though the earth has dropped beneath his feet, that the whole world has changed in a trice, and worried about the effects of it. Do you think it's as seismic an event as that?
I do.
Yes. And you think
I
it's for the
share
good?
the emotion, in a sense, but in the other direction. I think it's an absolutely stunning result, but one that has huge opportunity for our country and indeed the world. But I think we got to make the most of it now. That's the most important thing. And I agree with absolutely everything Chuck said earlier about really using this as a wake-up call to address some of those problems that have been festering for so long and I think have led to this result. And it's not just the last few years. I think it goes back decades, actually. This sense of people losing control, about power going into fewer and fewer hands, not just in relation to government and politics, but in the economy too, with big businesses operating around the world and being callous about the impact of their decisions on real people's lives. I think that's what this vote is all about. It's a rejection of all of that, and I think we've got to really take it seriously.
But Steve, I think the interesting thing about this take control argument that has been made by many who've advocated us leaving the European Union is the idea is to take back control to the UK state. But most of the people who've been making the argument do not believe in active government in the economy in terms of interventions to make and try and shape the global economy so it better delivers for people. And that's why I think there's a slight, I mean, there'll be lots of interpretation on this. You see it as a constitutional power thing. I think there's definitely that. But I think ultimately, why is it that immigration has prevailed and been such a potent issue? Is because you've got an economy that people don't think is working for them. And actually, this thing comes down to how do we make globalisation work for middle and lower income earners who frankly think that for a kind of internationally mobile 1%, it works, but for them, it doesn't. And I don't think necessarily the small state solution that many of the people in Vote Leave believe when it comes to domestic politics is necessarily what people are looking for.
I don't think it's a small state solution either. I think it's a decentralised state. It's a state that understands and responds to the real lives of real people. If we're talking about making globalisation work for people, in the end, that's not to do with what happens in Brussels or institutions miles away. It's about human beings. Do they have the skills and the potential to actually flourish in an economy that's changing so quickly? That's got to be done at the human level, at the neighbourhood level, and I think that's why this should be a wake-up call to pass power back, not just from Brussels to the UK, but within the UK as well.
I don't necessarily disagree with that.
All right. Well,
in terms of the need to decentralise power and give people more power, and that's not just going to the town hall, but going to people.
You saw Keith Vaz's face. It's an earthquake.
This is seismic.
Yeah,
It is an utter earthquake, and I think we, in some senses, will degrade this debate if it all comes down to a discussion about the future of David Cameron.
Yes.
This is going to affect every single person watching this programme, every family, every community. And if this just descends into, 24 hours, will Cameron stay? I frankly don't care. The priority in the short term has got to be to stabilise our economy, stabilise the markets. Sterling is dropping like you will not believe. This is a very, very serious situation.
There is a question, of course, a legitimate question about who can best stabilise things at this stage, isn't there?
Well, I have to say, I mean, in the medium to short term, I don't see how Cameron can lead the negotiation. And I think it's very, very important that we get the best deal possible in terms of the negotiation of our exit for my constituents and every person watching this programme. I think he is slightly compromised because of what's happened in his ability to lead that. And I'm just saying, I'm not making a party political point here, but whoever is in charge, they've got to get the best deal now. The people have spoken. But we've got to remember in this debate, 48% of people did not want this to happen. And everybody must respect the result, but also respect the fact that this is a divided result.
All right. Emily, go back to you.
Yeah, let's talk to Andrew Rawnsley and Isabel Hardman. It's been called seismic, this moment, but it's also...
Yeah, it's Richter 9 or 10. How high can you go on the Richter scale? I don't know.
I think we're off 10, aren't we? Yeah. But it's also unprecedented. Nobody has ever left the EU before, and I don't think anyone has ever left an economic union
Greenland did, but long ago, and that's a slightly non-comparable example. You're quite right, Emily. I mean, this is a major member of the European Union leaving, one of its most important economies. So we've this evening, obviously, and overnight, we've been concentrating on the effects in Britain. But I mean, there'll be people reeling with shock around Europe. Now, when I was talking to diplomats and other people around Europe before the referendum, yeah, they were seriously concerned. But I think deep down, they thought in the end, the Brits, even if reluctantly, would vote to stay. And a key thing now will be how they react. Now, of course, they're going to bring out statements saying we regret it, but the show goes on. But the truth is they know this is a massive blow to the EU's sense of its own self-esteem, potentially its clout in the world. The people it's most likely to energise in politics in Europe are people like Marine Le Pen in France and in other European countries, populists to the right who also want to take their countries out of the EU. And we'll see how they react, because obviously if things go really badly, because we're still going to have some relationship with our continent, the negotiations will become very poisoned. And will people in the European Union say, we've got to be punitive to Britain to deter anybody else from doing this? Or will others say, we still need a relationship with Britain? And of course, that will slightly depend on how Britain approaches it as well.
And there will be real concerns about a domino effect in Europe, because it's not as though Britons are grouchier about the EU than other countries. Actually, the polling over the last few months has shown this in Italy, in France, in Holland. Voters are not fans of the European Union, and this could really inspire voters, at least in
You think this is the beginning of the end of the EU as a whole?
Well, I think it's going to have huge
Some
effects
serious
across the
people have
European
worried
Union.
about that. I wouldn't go that far, but some serious people have worried.
What happens now, in technical terms? David Cameron's made very clear on his optimistic way of thinking that there was no plan B. The civil service didn't have anything in mind for if this happened. So how prepared are we for this?
Well, there's a debate about whether he should trigger Article 50 quickly or not, but also whether he should stay on as leader to do this. But what he has to do quite immediately is go back on some of the things that he said during the campaign. He claimed that Brexit would put a bomb under the economy. Now, things are already looking quite shaky. Yeah. For the Prime Minister to carry on leading, he needs to somehow say, oh, I didn't really mean that, everything's going to be OK, which is going to be quite difficult.
But there's an additional problem, I'd say, which is partly what people have voted for. Yes, it appears now pretty clear they're voting, although by a fairly small margin, to leave the European Union. But of course, we're not going to tow off into the mid-Atlantic. It will still be our biggest trading partners, our closest neighbours. That's a fact of geography. And of course, what this vote by its binary nature couldn't be was, well, if you don't want to be a member of the European Union, what sort of relationship then do you want with the European Union? Do you want to be Norway, Switzerland, Turkey, Albania? And the Out campaign never really agreed on this. I mean, they slightly changed their account of what we would end up being.
Before we get to that point, there is, of course, this question that's sort of been a shadowy figure of a second referendum, of going back to ask again, or another election which might trigger a second referendum. Are we now saying that cannot, in democratic circumstances, happen?
Well, Jean-Claude Juncker did rule that out pretty clearly this week, saying...
That was before, wasn't it?
Yes, you might see some attempt, but I suspect that actually the European leaders will want to say to other countries, no, this is that, basically, that's it. You can't fiddle around, because actually if you have a second referendum, the chances are that Britain can vote to leave even more overwhelmingly, and you don't want that sort of dragging...
Although Boris Johnson, leading light of the Out campaign, did flirt with this idea of a second record. I mean, I do think, because this process is at least 2 years, probably, if not longer, if Article 50 is triggered, when and if that's triggered, as Isabel says. Now, if what's happening in the markets now is a precursor to the really serious economic damage that the Prime Minister, the Remain campaign, said would be a result of this outvote, well, we'll see what public opinion does, and whether people say, we can't reverse this, but do we want a referendum on the eventual terms of the deal?
Do you really
I
think
would
we're going
broadly
to get
agree
this...
with Isabel. I think it's very hard to turn, when a country's voted as it has, to say, oh, we'll have a second go to see if you do the right answer next time. The danger is you would get more resounding no, actually.
What about the Brexit?
Have a habit of doing that,
yes, they
of saying you
yeah.
gave us the wrong answer.
Until you get it right. What about the Brexit austerity budget? Do you think we'll actually see that enacted?
I don't think so. I don't think George Osborne's going to survive for very long, but I don't think that a chancellor as political as him would...
You think he'll be gone by the weekend?
Not
in his
well,
current
I don't know
job?
whether it's by the weekend, but I don't think he's going to be...
Well, I mean, there's just a practical thing. When there's so much economic volatility, whether you want to... Whatever his medium to long-term future, and this goes for David Cameron as well, whether you want to lose your chancellor in the middle of what could be potentially extreme turbulence on world markets.
But Brexit Tories were gunning for Osborne way before this, even when they thought that Remain might win, that they saw him as the sacrificial lamb. So the idea that he could survive for very long is...
Does one character emerge for you to take on the Brexit negotiations?
That's a good question. Who's going to be the Brexit negotiator?
That was my question to you.
Yes. Well, they never told us, did they? I don't think they know. I mean, because I think deep down they're quite surprised. I mean, remember, Nigel Farage was conceding earlier in the night.
Yes, it's been a strange night if you're Nigel Farage,
which is normally not what politicians do. No, I'm not. I mean, there are big questions for them now because their huge responsibility is descending.
So is your sense that they were never quite expecting to win this? It was just meant to be a sort of an insurgent rallying cry?
No, I think there were lots of true believers in the Leave camp who always thought this was possible. But I think you've got two key figures here, which are Boris Johnson and Michael Gove, who've actually had very good campaigns, obviously.
They won, so they become the establishment that they railed about the last few months.
And the experts.
The experts.
Thank you both. David.
Thank you very much. Let's now look at how things stand and how this story is unfolded and where it is that the Leave campaign has won and where it is that the Remain campaign has won in this very close vote, which leaves 4 points at the moment between the two sides. Jeremy.
Yes, let me actually take you inside the Queen Elizabeth Tower here. And what we thought we would do is a comparison with the first referendum in 1975 so we can see how the nation is divided. So let's just bring on a clock face here. And this is, I guess, as close as we get to a swingometer in a referendum night. This is England in 75. And you can see the blue there is Leave. And England was 31.5% Leave in 1975. Now, this is so dramatic. Watch this as we feed in the results from the last 24 hours. Look at that. Over the 50%, nearly 55%. England actually more Eurosceptic on average than the country as a whole. So a massive change in England over those 4 decades. And actually in Wales, too. Have a look. We'll turn the tower, change the clock, go back to 75, and 35% in Wales saying no to the EU. On the losing side, the majority saying Remain. Now look at the figure for 2016. Here it comes, and again it's over 50%. So Wales much more Eurosceptic than it was in 1975. So England and Wales very similar. But now the story changes. If you look at Northern Ireland in 1975, you see quite a high level of Eurosceptic voting in that referendum. Very conservative part of the country back then, nearly 50% against. They've actually become more inclined towards the EU in the last 4 decades. And the Leave voters dropped there to below 45%, so Remain then on the increase in Northern Ireland, we learn in the last 24 hours. And Scotland also, the same sentiment. So in 75, this was the Leave vote, 41%. In 2016, it drops back. And you have this extraordinary situation, whereas one Scottish politician was saying earlier, you're told to stay in the UK to remain in the EU. You stay in the UK, it has the reverse effect, with parts of England effectively pulling Scotland out of the EU. So it's very dramatic, isn't it? Northern Ireland and Scotland becoming more enthusiastic about the European Union. Wales and England, over the last 40 years, dramatically more sceptical.
Thanks very much. We've got a comment from Paddy Ashdown, Lord Ashdown, who was with us earlier, who just says, Lord, God help our country, his tweet. And we're joined by Neil Hamilton, who's the leader of UKIP in the Welsh Assembly. So, Mr. Hamilton, you've won. What do you think should happen now?
Well, the government's now got to take control. The things that we've given away to Brussels, we've got to take back again. And most particularly, they've got to work on a credible system for immigration control. We've got to get back our seat on the World Trade Organization so that we can take control of the tariffs and so on. So, for example, in the steel industry in Port Talbot, we can impose tariffs against steel which is dumped on our markets by the Chinese at way below cost. There's so many things which in the short term the government has to do. But in the longer term, obviously, we've got to disentangle ourselves from the morass of regulation and legislation that we've accumulated over 40 years. That isn't going to happen overnight.
Well, what's the timescale of this? What's the timescale in your view? What should happen tomorrow and next week?
Well, I think the government should first of all give the EU notice that it's invoking Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty, which begins the process of negotiation as to our future trading relationship with the EU. We are free traders. We want to continue to have access to the single market on the same basis as we have now, and that would be hugely in the EU's interest because we have a massive trade deficit with them. So we need to resolve that uncertainty, and that's a matter of great importance, and they should move on that very quickly.
And how soon do you think that the control of immigration, once you're not subject to EU freedom of movements, should take place?
I think that could happen quite quickly too.
What does quite quickly mean?
Well, I don't know what the administrative complications are in the short term in terms of recruitment and design of an Australian-style points-based system, but that's something which I would have thought could be designed and put together in 12 months or less.
Do you think this is Farage's victory because you're a UKIP member? You think it's his doing?
Oh, absolutely. UKIP would not be where it is today but for Nigel Farage's vision and his dynamism, and we would not have had the referendum without that. So let's be under no illusions whatsoever that this is his victory first and foremost.
I want to talk to Caroline Lucas, who's just joined us, but Andrea Leadsom, as a Conservative MP, somebody who, an Energy Minister, Leadsom, you were at that great debate at Wembley. Are you surprised this happened?
No, I'm not surprised. I think it's a fantastic opportunity for the UK. I really do. I'm so excited about it. I'm not at all surprised. I think in talking to people, in going about doing rallies and so on, it was very clear that people have just had enough. They've had enough of being told what to do. But really importantly as well, they just didn't buy all the kind of fear-mongering, scaremongering.
But let's look ahead. How quickly would you like to see the government act? Would you like Article 50 to be invoked immediately in Brussels? Would you like do you envisage the possibility of immigration being cut immediately as a result of this vote?
I think what we now will want to do is to take a calm and rational look at exactly what the next steps are. And invoking Article 50 is one opportunity. There are other alternatives.
What are the alternatives?
Well, as Bill Cash said, you could have a separate negotiation. It doesn't have to be through Article 50. When Greenland left the EU, Article 50 didn't exist, so they didn't use Article 50. It's perfectly possible to have a bilateral agreement with the European Union and to make different arrangements. So I think what we need to do is to calmly reflect on what the alternatives are, but at the same time to look at the possibilities of a presumption of continuity for the free trade agreements that we're already party to as a member of the EU, and all of the trade negotiations both with the EU and with other countries that at the moment we are unable to trade with directly.
But all right, you're the Chancellor of the Exchequer. The markets are tumbling, sterling's falling. What do you do immediately?
Well, we need to be, as I say, calm reflection.
How can you have calm reflection when the world is falling about your...
Because actually the world isn't falling about your feet. And actually, I really regret when people say those things. Markets are volatile. We've just had a period of extraordinary scaremongering, really quite extraordinarily, trying to up the ante on volatility in the market. And as we know, the market will always position itself to try and take profit from something like this. They got it wrong, and now there's a very big surprise. And so it's perfectly likely that there will be some volatility, but our fundamentals in our economy remain very strong. And, I've been 30 years in financial services. I lived through the ERM crisis and certainly the 2008 crisis and the Barings Bank crisis. The fundamentals in our economy are extraordinarily strong. And if we keep calm and if we take measured decisions and don't rush into things, then it will be fine. And it's a superb opportunity for the UK.
Okay, I just wondered, Andrew, what you thought should happen first thing in the morning, when the markets open here. I think you're absolutely right that the fundamentals haven't changed particularly from yesterday to today. But if the markets are absolutely in free fall and much more aggressively than 2008 financial crisis and the ERM, what should the Treasury actually do with the Bank of England?
Well, the Bank of England has tools at its disposal, and I'm quite sure that the Bank of England will be looking to see what, if any, steps they need to take. But I do think that what we do need is calm, measured discussion. We haven't had that for the last few weeks.
But the markets
now,
may not wait.
The
markets may not wait.
Well,
they're not going to wait for you. You've seen the volatility
this morning,
overnight.
We need calm, measured discussion this morning. So, you know, the markets, of course, will react with the uncertainty, as you've been saying throughout the night. But it's uncertainty. It doesn't mean that the economic fundamentals have changed. There are huge opportunities for the UK economy of leaving the EU, and it is a case of calm, measured reflection on the fact that this is fine and this is a very big decision, but there are easy steps that we can take to put ourselves back in control, that we can calm the markets and avoid that kind of destabilising effect.
Well, listening to you is Caroline Lucas of the Green Party, MP for the Green Party. Caroline Lucas, how have you reacted to this news of the democratic will of the British people who've decided they want to leave the EU?
Well, I think this is an absolutely devastating result. Personally, I feel pretty heartbroken. I think it has revealed massive divisions within our country. It feels like there is such levels of alienation and anger and frustration, which I think is a real wake-up call to Westminster. I mean, we've got here, you know, basically people rebelling against the leaders of the 98% of MPs who are in Westminster. And my hope, I suppose, is that as we go forward and try to work out how to heal the country again and to heal some of these divisions, we can have a debate about wider constitutional issues, not just about what the people have now said about withdrawing from the EU, but how to make sure people have a voice in our democracy more broadly. And I think that will have to include looking at things like our voting system. We have a government that, as we know, was elected with just 24% of the eligible vote. I think part of the anger that we're hearing from around the country actually was less to do with the EU per se and more to do with a sense of just having been unheard, unlistened to for so many years.
So are you saying it wasn't actually a vote about whether to remain or leave in the EU? It was a symbolic vote of defiance against MPs in the House of Commons, who, after all, in a majority were in favour of staying, and of this particular government? Is that what you mean?
I think the EU was a kind of proxy for very legitimate anger. I mean, we saw it particularly played out over the issue of immigration, where so many people's very real concerns, very legitimate concerns about housing, about public services, about access to health and so forth, so much throughout this campaign was able to be blamed on immigration, when we know in actual fact freedom of movement is bringing finance into the country, and the benefits of that finance were not being properly shared. And so one of the learning points surely would have been that what we should have been doing is not just saying, yes, there's an economic dividend from immigration, but actually making sure that that funding went into the places under greatest pressure so that there was funding for services and, you know, for everything from libraries to leisure centres to make people understand that there really is something for everybody in this.
But as you know, the Leave campaign never put a figure on how it wanted to cut immigration. It simply said it would be able to control immigration outside the EU. It begs the question of how many migrants will be allowed in year on year.
Well, you're absolutely right, and there was never any clarity from the Leave campaign about how you know, they were going to wave the wand and immigration was going to vanish, even if that's what was wanted. I think that in many ways people have been sold a kind of a snake oil. You know, they've been told that leaving the EU was going to be the solution to a whole range of problems. And what I fear is that actually some of the people who already are hurting most from austerity, from an economic programme that simply isn't helping some of the poorest people, I think they're going to find that leaving the EU is going to make that even worse.
Caroline Lucas, thank you very much for joining us. Let's now go to James Landale, who is at the Remain headquarters, or what's left of the Remain headquarters, which doesn't seem to be very much, James. Good morning.
Yeah, no, there's not much there here at all now. I have to. The dawn has broken here at the Royal Festival Hall on the south bank of the Thames. We all remember almost 20 years ago, this was where Tony Blair gave that famous speech, "A new dawn has broken, has it not?" that was a moment of extraordinary euphoria amongst the crowds that were outside. I have to say the mood here is pretty much directly the opposite. Most people have left now. The mood was pretty grim. People were hugging each other. There were one or two tears in the corner because they're just sitting there scratching their heads thinking, what on earth went wrong? Some of them are thinking, look, they never had an argument to address the question about immigration. They tried to change it, the debate to the economy, but they never actually addressed the attacks they were getting over immigration. That's one thing. Another point others made is, well, maybe there was too much basic politics. David Cameron versus Boris Johnson. My document is better than your document. Instead of bringing the debate back to what they see as the more fundamental issues. But primarily, a lot of them are just saying, look, the tide was against them on this. That clearly an extraordinary thing has happened here in this vote in the last 24 hours. And they wonder, was there anything they could have done, anything different in this campaign that would have changed that? That's what they're thinking now.
Thank you very much, James. Now, Emily Thornberry is with us, Labour MP, Shadow Defence Secretary. What do you make of what's happened? You're looking rather downcast, I have to say.
I've been thinking about what Andrea's been saying, and very much one of the slogans that were used by the Brexiteers was "Let's take back control." But what I don't hear from her is what the plan is now. If the pound is now at a lower level than it has been since 1985, we do need to have a plan, and it isn't really enough to kind of say, well, let's sit back and have a think about it. We seem to hear different things from different people, so I think that's very worrying. I think in the end, it's going to be a very challenging period. We are a great country. We can get through this, but it is going to be really hard. You've called the vote, and we haven't heard all the results yet, but if you're right, then it's going to be a very difficult period. And I think, well, leaving aside the plan, leaving aside the economy, leaving aside what we're going to do in order to pull ourselves together, I think we also have to face the fact that half of the people in this country felt that the existing system did not work for them. And I think they felt that Europe was part of that existing system, and we have to be able to face that challenge and to look at, when I was talking to people, they were saying, I'm thinking of voting to leave the European Union because I've got 2 adult sons living with me. They can't move out of the house. There's either not enough homes, Emily, or there are too many people. One of the answers is to leave Europe. Of course, the other answer is to build more homes. But, I'm fed up with not being able to get access to my doctor. There are many things like that were blamed on Europe. Now.
So are you saying this referendum was used by the voters as a proxy for punishing both the Labour Party and the Conservative Party for policies over a long period?
I think it was a kickback on the establishment, and I think that the EU was part of that.
Do you think it was a mistake to hold the referendum?
I think, the decision was made. Obviously, it was so much always about Cameron. It was so much about, his position within the Conservative Party, keeping the Conservative Party happy was why we needed to have the referendum. We all know it was about internal Conservative Party politics. And then the election itself was fronted up by David Cameron, and it was very difficult to kind of get in around the side of him in order to be able to argue some of the other issues, which is, very unfortunate, I think. I think that in a way, some of the kind of kicking against the establishment was also part of what we saw in some ways with the election of Jeremy Corbyn, which is he was also seen as an anti-establishment figure. And actually, in many ways, if he'd been able to have an opportunity to speak more than he did, in fact, his kind of, I give the EU 7 out of 10, I've been thinking about this. Actually, I think
7.5 out of 10.
7.5 out of 10. I think spoke more truthfully to the British public than some of the other arguments that were being put forward. So I think there's a lot to think about tonight.
How do you know it wasn't just people thinking they didn't want to be in the EU?
Well, I think when I spoke to people about why they said they didn't want to be in the EU, they did talk about things like, I spoke to a plasterer today who said he was fed up with not being paid enough, knowing there were people breathing down his neck, other people that could get his job. He didn't feel that the terms and conditions that he was living on were good enough. We actually, within Britain, could solve that by making our terms and conditions better, by upping the minimum wage. Those powers actually are in the Prime Minister's hands, whether we're in the EU or not. But people looked to see who can we blame, and they turned their sights on the EU.
We'll go on with this in a moment, but first of all, let's have a summary of the news, a full roundup of the news this morning. Here's Rita Chakrabarti.
Thank you, David. The BBC forecasts that Britain has voted to leave the EU. With most votes counted, the Leave camp has so far taken 52% of the vote after strong wins in North East England and in the Midlands. The result, when confirmed, will unleash a period of considerable political and financial uncertainty in the country and across the world. Our political correspondent Eleanor Garnia's report begins with the moment the BBC announced its prediction.
Well, at 20 minutes to 5, we can now say the decision taken in 1975 by this country to join the common market has been reversed by this referendum to leave the EU. We are absolutely clear now that there is no way that the Remain side can win.
Watch and listen carefully. This is history in the making.
The British people have spoken, and the answer is we're out.
It's unbelievable, isn't it? Change the face of Europe!
And these were the celebrations just moments before the BBC called the result.
This will be a victory for real people, a victory for ordinary people, a victory for decent people.
With the pound plunging, Remain campaigners warned of turmoil ahead.
This is a crushing decision. It's a terrible day for Britain and a terrible day for Europe with, immense consequences.
This moment, this is a seismic moment for our country that goes far beyond all the personalities. There's going to be a lot of chat what happens to David Cameron. This is a big thing for our country. And what this has exposed is a lot of division, and there's a lot of talk as if this is an overwhelming win. It isn't. There's 48% of people on the current projection who did not vote for this.
It wasn't long after polls closed before Leave started marking up big wins.
Ladies and gentlemen.
Across the northeast, results soon showed Leave doing consistently better than predicted. A big win in Hartlepool and pushing Remain into a narrow victory in Newcastle.
65,404.
A much smaller win than expected.
Votes cast in favour of Leave.
Away from the north of England, in Basildon in Essex, another big win for Leave. And another count with a big turnout at 74%. And in Flintshire, just as across the rest of Wales, voters backed Brexit. But in Edinburgh, the Remain campaign secured a big win. And there was good news for Remain across London, picking up significant Remain wins. But Britain has voted to leave the European Union, to tear up the settlement the country's had for decades, unleashing perhaps huge opportunity or perhaps huge risk, perhaps both. Eleanor Garnia, BBC News.
Well, the results have upset the world's financial markets with a dramatic fall in the value of the pound to $1.34, its biggest one-day drop in 30 years. When the polls closed last night, the pound soared to $1.50, but as support for leaving the EU became clear, the pound began to plummet. Stocks in Asia are trading sharply down. Traders say they haven't seen such dramatic moves since the financial crisis of 2008. Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon has suggested that the Leave vote will reignite demands for an independence referendum there. After all 32 Scottish local authority areas returned majorities for Remain, Ms Sturgeon said the EU vote made clear that the people of Scotland see their future as part of the European Union. Well, that's all the news for now. Back to the studio.
So let's look for a moment at Northern Ireland and the crucial border between Northern Ireland and the south of Ireland. Mark Devonport is our Northern Ireland editor. What do you think the consequences of Britain, the UK, leaving the EU will be for that border? We heard some early on in the campaign, people worrying about the border, saying it would cause terrible trouble in Northern Ireland, that for years they had an open border and now it would become a closed border. Is that what's going to happen? What do you think?
Well, we're really in uncharted territory with this, David. We had, as you said, a number of visitors, high-profile visitors during the campaign, the Chancellor, two former Prime Ministers, Sir John Major and Tony Blair, all predicting that we could have a return to border checks and that this could be extremely disruptive in terms of the progress that has been made in Northern Ireland thus far. Now, the question is, what will happen, because Leave campaigners have been playing this down? The Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Theresa Villas, who was a leading campaigner for the Leave camp, insisted that the free movement deal that we have here in Ireland would continue because it predates the EU. However, it has to be said that the Irish government has seen itself as a player in this, has been lobbying openly for a Remain argument, and it will have to be something that will be handled very sensitively, diplomatically by Dublin, which remains within the European Union, very committed member of the European Union, but now has a 300-mile border within the island of Ireland, which is now a border, or will become a border, between the European Union and an independent UK outside the Union.
Does it have, very briefly, does it have to be a border with police checks on every lane and every crossing?
I don't think that either the Irish government or the British government will want anything of that kind. They've put so much work into doing away with the security installations that we've seen in the past. But they will still, potentially, if we have some kind of new system of tariffs brought in, have to come up with some system to check people moving goods across that border and to try and work out whether there should be checks of people moving within Ireland or whether there should be new checks on people's movement between Ireland and Great Britain.
Thank you very much, Mark. We're joined now in our whiz round by Syed Kamal, the leader of the Conservative MEPs in the European Parliament, who was in favour of our leaving, and you're presumably glad to be out of a job soon.
Well, I've always said that whatever the result, that it was important that we respected the result. The British people have voted to leave, and I think what's important that whatever our personal views might have been, we respect that result and we move on. I'm going straight into meetings this morning with the leaders of the other political groups here in the European Parliament to start talking about the next steps.
Among other members of the Parliament will be to this quite, as we've been calling it here, seismic change in the balance of power in the EU with Britain's departure.
Sorry, I missed the early part of that question.
What do you think the reaction of your colleagues in the Parliament of various parties will be to Britain's departure from the EU?
Well, I've been speaking to a number of colleagues this week in Brussels, MEPs as well as commissioners, and they have said to me, look, you know, we would rather you don't leave, but actually if you do leave, it's really important that we get a deal that we're both happy with, so that Britain are good neighbours rather than reluctant tenants.
So what do you think the first moves will be?
Well, what I'm going to do this morning is go into meetings with the other leaders of the political groups in the European Parliament to talk about actually how we start these negotiations. Then Martin Schulz, the President of the Parliament, will meet with the President of the Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, and Donald Tusk, the President of the Council. Next week, David Cameron will come out here and meet with fellow Prime Ministers. And so we'll have in place the procedure and the discussion, how we'll go about the discussions.
So you don't think it's going to be a turbulent period? You sound as though you think it's going to be very easily accomplished.
I think what's important is actually that we do put in place certainty. That's important, and it's part of my job now to go into this meeting with the other leaders of the European political groups to feed back to Number 10 and to make sure that we're quite clear about the next steps in the negotiations.
Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Let's just have a look at tomorrow morning's papers. The Sun here, see you later. Daily Mail, we're out. The Daily Mirror, we're out. And the Indie, out. Of course, we aren't yet out. We've just had an advisory referendum saying we should be out. So, see you later, we're out, we're out. Vernon Bogdanor, Professor of Government, what is the next step? What is the rational way for this democratic decision to be implemented?
Nothing much will happen immediately. The only immediate effect will be that the settlement that David Cameron achieved in February will not come into play. That is, the comparatively mild restrictions on freedom of movement will not be applied. But the next step will be for David Cameron to tell the European Council next week how Britain has voted and invoke Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty, which is the legal procedure by which a
Well, you hardly have to tell them how they voted. They've heard it.
Well, they have.
Say, oh, by the
heard
way, you don't know this, but actually, Britain's voted out.
No, he'll have to make a formal approach to the European Council. Until he does that, nothing can actually happen. And there's a difficulty here because it will take up to 2 years to withdraw. But I suspect most of those who voted for Brexit hoped that with one bound they would be free and that we'd immediately be free of EU laws.
How much discussion? How much discussion can take place before you invoke Article 50? You don't have to say. You say we've had an advisory referendum. Britain has decided to leave. Now, can we have some conversations about how we might do this before we start the formal procedure, or do you think it's inevitable or constitutionally, since you're a constitutionalist, constitutionally proper for him pretty well immediately to invoke Article 50?
There's no time limit on the application of Article 50, but David Cameron has said that he will invoke it immediately, and that would be the honourable approach to take. Britain has made a decision. It's now for the government to implement that decision and to secure withdrawal with the least fuss. It's worth saying that the withdrawal agreement is not the same as a trade agreement, and the Brexiteers themselves are divided on whether Britain should have a trade agreement with the European Union or not. But this raises a much larger problem of whether the people in charge of this negotiation should be the people whose advice has been rejected. Because, after all, the British people have given an instruction to the government and to Parliament to do something they don't want to do. That has not happened before in Parliament's history. Now, if you were instructing a solicitor, David, to do something for you, would you not rather have a solicitor who agreed with what you were doing rather than someone who's told you not to do what you propose to do? So I think this raises acute questions about the future of the government and indeed the representative nature of the Parliament, around 2/3 of whose members are opposed to Brexit. The sovereignty of the people, I think, goes much deeper, controls the sovereignty of Parliament in this particular case, I think.
These areas are still waiting for the count to be completed, but the Leave campaign is now 400,000 short of the 16.8 that we were. They're ahead by, yes, the figure they've got to get to is 16,800,000. It's 16,400,000, so it's 400 to go. So those ones are still coming in. Now, Andrew Neil joins us. Andrew, do you think there's going to have to be a general election because of what Vernon Bogdanor was saying? You've got to have somehow, somebody's got to work out who's going to negotiate with the EU, and you can't have a Prime Minister who was thinking one thing and a Chancellor who was thinking one thing, constructively and optimistically and cooperatively negotiating something quite different.
I don't think there are any plans to have a general election. I think the strategy of the Brexit Tories, if I can call them that, the people who've won, is to get into the driving seat to drive the negotiations. I think although you will hear a lot of talk today about how David Cameron should stay as Prime Minister, there are plenty of Conservatives who privately think that won't happen. And after a decent and relatively short interval, Mr. Cameron will be replaced as Prime Minister. One Tory said to me, how can we let a man who got such a useless renegotiation, his words, not mine, for this referendum, then handle our divorce negotiations? So I think you'll see a new team in place, and if a lot of Tories get their way, probably a new Prime Minister as well, sometime this summer.
What do you think it will mean for the EU as a whole, the EU without us?
Well, Remain has said this will be a crisis for Britain. We'll see in the weeks and months ahead if that's true. I think there's no question. It is certainly a crisis for the European Union. It comes at a time when the European Union couldn't be weaker to cope with this. The Eurozone economies are still struggling to get out of stagnation. They're only just above 1% growth. There is a looming Italian banking crisis which could bring them back down. They've got the migration crisis still going as well. And a recent Europe-wide survey showed that Eurosceptic feeling has never been stronger. It's stronger in France than it is in Britain. It's about the same in Spain and Germany as it is in Britain as well. And you see non-mainstream parties very strong in France. Will take comfort from this. Madame Le Pen is polling #1 at the moment. The Five Star Movement, another Eurosceptic party in Italy, they now control Rome. The Lega Norda is strong in northern Italy. Spain doesn't have a government. Portugal has a very weak government that's in loggerheads with Brussels. Poland already has a Eurosceptic government, so does Hungary. You add all that together and you can see that it's not exactly a united front. And this will divide Europe as well. The European Union will be divided on how it should now deal with Britain. France and Germany will be divided. The North and the South will be divided on what their negotiating position should be.
So divisions all around, and of course the example of a successful Brexit referendum here. How can any of this be resolved? Who would take a lead? I mean, one would assume that Germany would take the lead, being the most powerful country in the EU and the one who at the moment is sort of holding Greece's hand through this crisis. We know all the chaos that's going on, but who actually can drive through some scheme or plan for keeping the show on the road? Or are you suggesting the wheels have come off the vehicle and that's it?
No, I don't think the wheels will come off. What I'm suggesting is that we'll probably enter a period of a kind of phony war. I think it will be the tactic in Britain not to implement Article 50 right away, because when you do that, the clock runs and you only have 2 years to do it. I think there'll be lots of informal talks going on, particularly with the Germans and the Benelux countries and the Scandinavians, who are more kindly disposed to Britain as opposed to the French and the Italians and Spain. You could get a lot of that going on long before we get to triggering Article 50. And indeed, I've heard talk from people around Michael Gove and Boris Johnson that they shouldn't even trigger Article 50 until you get the French elections out of the way, which are next spring, and maybe even the German elections out of the way, which aren't until next autumn. So there could be, because they don't want Britain's terms of divorce to become an issue in either the French or the German elections, particularly the French ones, where anything that the French agree to give to the British, Madame Le Pen for the National Front will say, well, why, Monsieur Hollande or Monsieur Sarkozy, can't we have that too? So it will play into European politics big time.
What about the American aspect of this? Because we had President Obama over here urging Britain to stay, saying they'd be at the back of the queue if we left, and obviously concerned about Britain's role. Americans have always wanted us in Europe. They've always said that's the best place for you to influence things along with your special relationship with us.
Well, the State Department in Washington has been up all night monitoring this, and they will now have to have a major rethink of what their approach is to Britain. It has been a long-standing American foreign policy objective and aim that Britain should be part of the European Union. That has been true of Democratic governments and Republican governments. That will now no longer be the case. So American foreign policy will now have to come to terms with a Britain that is not part of the EU, but will still have to deal with the EU. It will need to look at beefing up its relations, particularly with Germany, but also to some extent France too, and wonder how it can now develop a more bilateral foreign policy with London. So it's a big change and the end of a historic period in American foreign policy towards Britain as well.
Andrew, thank you very much. I know you'll be back later on, 9 o'clock, I think, to carry on the story of a day that'll be quite extraordinary day, really. Do you expect the Prime Minister to make a statement before 9? He has to make a statement before the markets open, presumably.
Yes, I think the Prime Minister will be under huge pressure to make a statement. I think he's still under even greater pressure to work out exactly what he's going to say. I think the most we can expect from the Prime Minister, at least this morning, will be a holding statement. It won't be a definitive statement. I'd be amazed if he resigned, but I think he'll leave that issue open for future statements.
But you think within a week or two he might resign, or do you think we're talking about the autumn? Or
I don't know the timetable, but again, the mood on the Tory backbenches will be for change. Again, one Conservative said to me, the way we can now shoot UKIP's fox entirely is to have a Brexit leader of the Conservative Party. If you've got a Brexit leader of the Conservative Party, then what's the point of any Tories thinking of voting for UKIP? UKIP may still be a problem for Labour in its northern heartlands, but if we've won the referendum and we have a Brexit leader of the party, then UKIP ceases to be the threat that it has been in recent years to the Conservatives.
Andrew, thank you very much. See you later on, anyway.
See you later.
Let's join Joe Coburn, who is in Manchester, where this whole count is going to, at some point later, finally be announced with all the figures in, and she's with Gisela Stewart.
Yes, David, here in Manchester, there is a mixture, a sense of shock, if you like, and there is also jubilation on the side of the Leavers as the result is still sinking in. You're quite right, I have Gisela Stewart here with me, who is one of the few Labour MPs who was for Brexit to leave the EU and chair of Vote Leave. Can you believe it?
It's a surprise, given that the might of the government, money and everything else was thrown at us. But what was quite extraordinary is that 33 million people went to the ballot box. They reflected on a 40-year history of our relationship with the European Union. And by majority, they decided that they wanted to leave. And I think it's now a responsibility for us as politicians to act in the best interest of the nation. So calm down, take cool steps, but put that process in play.
You said a few words in German. Why? You're obviously, that is your native country. You wanted to leave the European Union, something Germany is firmly, supportive of. Why did you speak in German here?
I thought it was very important that we make it clear that the United Kingdom is an open and outward-looking nation. It will continue to be open and outward-looking. We will work with European partners. We will work on the international level as before. It is simply the democratic governance structure which we have rejected. It's not the outward-lookingness which we have rejected.
But already we've seen signs of economic turmoil, the pound falling sharply, and you will be blamed for that economic turmoil.
Well, the markets clearly called it wrongly, but there's at the moment a bit of a hysteria going on because today's vote is in essence a start of a process, which I would suggest you start with informal discussions and then you decide what you do next. So that overreaction, I think, on calm reflection, they will realise that it's just gone too far.
Do you feel calm at the moment?
I feel at the moment, actually, I feel really excited at the fact that the people weren't bullied by the establishment, that the people decided that they did want to take back control, and that gives us an opportunity to kind of reboot our democratic structures and processes, and I just think that's amazing and wonderful.
But you're a Labour MP. Do you think David Cameron can survive as a Conservative Prime Minister?
Well, he and the Cabinet, I think, now have a responsibility to take the next steps. But
what are those next steps?
Well, they have to come together. They have to start deciding what the informal discussions are. But I think all the party political leaders have to reflect quite seriously on whether they have lost touch with what the grassroots voters actually want.
Has Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour leader, lost touch with what grassroots Labour voters want?
Well, given that all the political parties across the board were campaigning for Remain and the people by a majority said, no, we want to leave, that clearly shows that there's some disconnect going on. But now we have that opportunity to regain this. So I think it's very exciting, it's liberating.
Should there be a general election called?
No, I think we have had a decision, there's a stability here. It's now our responsibility to implement this in a responsible way. So I would say to anyone, whether they're delighted or disappointed, be responsible. That's the key thing now.
Gisela Stewart, thank you very much. Gisela Stewart will now be heading to London to meet up with others from Vote Leave. And that's it. Here, Manchester, at the moment, we'll have an official, of course, announcement in a couple of hours' time.
Thanks, Joe. J.K. Rowling has just tweeted, Scotland will seek independence now. Cameron's legacy will be breaking up two unions. Neither needed to happen. Emily.
The Welsh Brexit campaign leader is David Jones, and he joins us now. Thanks for joining us this evening. Give us a sense of the mood on the Tory backbenchers now.
Well, I think that there will be a great deal of relief that this process is now completed, but obviously amongst those who campaigned for a long time for this result, a great deal of pleasure too. We can now move forward to a new era.
You didn't sign the letter calling on David Cameron to stay. Do you think he should go?
Well, clearly, he has got to decide his own future. He was the man who presided over this campaign. However, what we do need is a period of stability, and I think that he needs to reflect upon what has happened. But the question of whether or not he decides to go must be a personal decision for him.
Would it be the right one?
I think, again, that's a matter for him. David Cameron has been an outstanding leader for the Conservative Party, but the fact is that on this occasion he called it wrong. And I think now, as I say, what we do need is a period of stability, and David Cameron has got to decide whether he feels that he is the person who can provide that stability.
The author, J.K. Rowling, has just tweeted that he will be remembered as the man who broke up not just one union, but two, if Scotland goes back for its second referendum.
Well, I think that what we have to reflect on is this. We have now taken our country back. The United Kingdom is on the way to being an independent country again. And I think that before the Scots decide on yet another referendum, they need to consider whether they want to be part of a strong United Kingdom or whether they want to be an insignificant part of what is clearly becoming an increasingly monolithic European Union that is moving towards becoming a superstate.
And when you talk about taking the country back, many people in the country will not know what has to happen next. Is David Cameron the right person to lead the Brexit negotiations, do you believe?
I think that he is in some difficulty, given that the negotiations that he completed in February clearly didn't impress the British people. As I say, this is an intensely personal decision. But I think that, and I must repeat, what we do need is stability and certainty, and we need that as quickly as possible. And that, I'm sure, is something that will be at the forefront of David Cameron's mind this morning.
I don't understand what that means. When you say we need stability quickly, are you calling for change or are you calling for continuation?
No, what I'm calling for is David Cameron to give consideration to whether he is the person who can provide the stability that the country needs. Clearly, we've got a negotiating process that we have to enter into fairly soon. There's the European Council only next week. He clearly will be representing Britain at that council. But after that, the period of negotiation will continue for some months, maybe more than a few months. And he has to give consideration to whether he is the person to do that.
And who do you think might be the right person if he isn't?
Well, that's going to be a matter ultimately for the Conservative Party. If David Cameron decides that he doesn't want to continue, then clearly there's going to have to be a process, first of all, within the parliamentary party and then within the wider party. And I think whatever happens, David Cameron needs to provide the continuity to enable that process to take place if he thinks that that is the right thing to do.
Would you like to see a snap general election now?
I think that that would be entirely the wrong thing, and I don't think that it's necessary, because we went into this Parliament having made a manifesto pledge to have a referendum. We've had that referendum. It's come up with a clear result on the part of the British people, and that must always have been foreseen by the government when they